December 14th, 2025. Polar bear attacks Air Force Base in Greenland. 5 soldiers mauled. The Arctic wind howled across the barren expanse of northwestern Greenland with the fury of 1,000 banshees, carrying with it ice crystals that cut through exposed flesh like microscopic razors. At precisely 0347 hours local time, Staff Sergeant Daniel Marcus Reeves pulled his Arctic parka tighter around his 6'2" frame and squinted through the swirling white chaos that had engulfed Thule Air Base for the past 14 hours. The 28-year-old communications specialist from Duluth, Minnesota, had been stationed at the northernmost U.S. military installation for 8 months, but he had never experienced a storm of this magnitude. The meteorological station had recorded sustained winds of 63 miles per hour with gusts exceeding 90, and the temperature had plummeted to minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit, not accounting for the wind chill that made it feel like minus 78 degrees. Daniel's breath formed immediate ice crystals in the frigid air as he made his way across the compound toward Building 1247. The communications hub that housed the sophisticated satellite uplink systems responsible for maintaining contact with Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado and the Pentagon. His insulated boots crunched through snow that had accumulated to a depth of nearly 4 feet in some areas, and the howling wind made it impossible to hear anything beyond a few yards. Behind him, Airman First Class Jennifer Marie Kowalski, a 22-year-old radar technician from Buffalo, New York, struggled to keep pace, her 5'6" frame working harder than usual against the brutal conditions. "Sergeant Reeves!" she shouted over the storm, her voice barely audible even though she was only 8 feet behind him. "The backup generators at the radar installation kicked on 20 minutes ago. We might lose primary power to the whole northern sector." Jennifer had arrived at Thule just 3 months earlier, fresh out of technical school at Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi. The transition from the Gulf Coast humidity to the Arctic desert had been jarring, but she had adapted quickly, earning commendations from her supervisors for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to troubleshoot complex electronic systems under pressure. Her parents, Polish immigrants who had settled in Buffalo's east side, had been proud when their youngest daughter enlisted, following in the footsteps of her older brother who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before returning to work at the Ford stamping plant. Daniel turned and cupped his gloved hands around his mouth to project his voice back to her. "Copy that, Kowalski. We'll check the power distribution panel first, then verify all satellite connections are secure." He paused, studying her face in the dim illumination provided by the scattered floodlights that managed to penetrate the blizzard. Ice had formed around the edges of her protective goggles, and her cheeks were already showing the telltale redness that preceded frostbite. "You good to continue, or do you need to warm up first?" "I'm good, Sergeant," she replied, though the slight tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. Jennifer had grown up in Buffalo snow, but nothing had prepared her for the relentless, bone-deep cold of the high Arctic. The wind seemed to find every microscopic gap in her gear, and despite wearing 4 layers, including her expedition-weight long underwear, moisture-wicking base layer, insulating fleece and outer shell, she could feel the cold seeping into her core. Technical Sergeant Michael Anthony Rodriguez, a 34-year-old aircraft maintenance chief from San Antonio, Texas, emerged from behind Building 1247, pushing a snow-covered cart loaded with emergency communication equipment. His 14 years of military service had taken him from the scorching heat of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar to the frozen tundra of Greenland, and his weathered face bore the evidence of countless hours working in extreme conditions. Michael's wife, Carmen, and their twin 8-year-old daughters, Sophia and Isabella, were currently living in base housing at Lackland Air Force Base, counting down the days until his deployment ended and he could return to San Antonio for their planned Christmas reunion. "Rodriguez!" Daniel called out, altering his course to intercept the maintenance chief. "What's the status on the primary communication array?" Michael paused, using his forearm to wipe accumulated snow from his goggles before responding. "The dish took a beating from the wind, but it's still operational," he reported, his breath creating a cloud of vapor that was immediately swept away by the gale. "However, I'm concerned about ice buildup on the reflector surface. If it gets much worse, we'll lose signal integrity to CONUS." The 3 airmen were part of a skeleton crew maintaining essential operations during what the base meteorologist had classified as a Category 4 Arctic storm, the second highest rating on the military's severe weather scale. Thule Air Base, officially designated as Thule Air Base/Pituffik Space Base, served as a critical early warning station for ballistic missile detection and a crucial link in the North American defense network. Located approximately 750 miles north of the Arctic Circle on the northwest coast of Greenland, the installation housed approximately 600 military personnel and contractors during peak operations, though the current storm had reduced the active duty roster to fewer than 200 essential personnel. Master Sergeant Patricia Louise Campbell, a 41-year-old security forces supervisor from rural Montana, was conducting her hourly perimeter check when she noticed something that made her pause mid-step. Patricia, who had spent her childhood on her family's cattle ranch near Billings, possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect when something was amiss in her environment. Her 23 years of military service, including 3 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, had honed her instincts to a razor-sharp edge. As she scanned the area near the southern fence line through her night vision goggles, she observed tracks in the snow that were unlike anything she had seen during her 18 months at Thule. The tracks were enormous, nearly 12 inches in length and 8 inches wide, with clearly visible claw marks extending 3 inches beyond the pad impressions. They formed a distinct pattern, indicating a 4-legged animal moving at a deliberate pace, and they were fresh, filled with only a light dusting of snow despite the ongoing blizzard. Patricia's ranching background had familiarized her with the tracks of various wildlife, including black bears and mountain lions, but these prints were significantly larger than anything she had encountered in Montana. "Control, this is Rover 1, she spoke into her radio, using the call sign for mobile security patrols. "I'm observing unusual animal tracks, approximately 200 meters south of Building 1156. The prints appear to be from a large quadruped, possibly a polar bear. Request permission to investigate further." Staff Sergeant Marcus James Thompson, a 29-year-old security forces controller from Detroit, Michigan, was manning the central security desk in Building 1010, monitoring feeds from the installation's network of surveillance cameras. The storm had reduced visibility to near zero on most of the exterior cameras, creating an electronic white noise effect that made meaningful observation nearly impossible. Marcus had joined the Air Force 6 years earlier after completing 2 years of criminal justice studies at Wayne State University. Drawn by the opportunity to serve his country while gaining experience in law enforcement that would benefit his long-term goal of joining the Michigan State Police. "Rover 1, control copies," Marcus responded, simultaneously pulling up the base's wildlife protocol manual on his computer terminal. "Be advised, the installation's wildlife management plan indicates polar bears are considered a low-probability threat due to seasonal migration patterns. However, extreme weather conditions can alter normal behavioral patterns. Maintain safe distance and continue observation." The Wildlife Management Plan, last updated in March 2024, contained detailed information about the various Arctic species that occasionally ventured onto the base property. Polar bears, designated as Ursus maritimus in the scientific literature, were known to inhabit the coastal regions of northwestern Greenland, but documented encounters with humans in the immediate vicinity of Thule Air Base were extremely rare. The plan noted that adult male polar bears could reach weights of up to 1,500 pounds and lengths of 10 feet, making them the largest terrestrial carnivores in North America. Their powerful limbs were capable of delivering devastating blows, and their bite force exceeded 1,200 pounds per square inch, sufficient to crush the skull of a seal or break through several inches of sea ice. Airman Basic Tyler James Morrison, an 18-year-old supply specialist from rural Alaska, was conducting an inventory count in Warehouse 7 when he heard what sounded like metallic scraping against the building's exterior wall. Tyler, who had grown up in Fairbanks and possessed extensive knowledge of Arctic wildlife, immediately recognized the sound as potentially dangerous. His father, a veteran hunting guide who had spent 35 years leading expeditions through Alaska's wilderness, had taught Tyler to identify the various sounds that different animals made when investigating human structures. "That's not the wind," Tyler muttered to himself, setting down his clipboard and moving cautiously toward the warehouse's main entrance. The 18-year-old had enlisted immediately after graduating from Lathrop High School, motivated by a desire to serve his country and gain experience that would help him establish his own guide service in Alaska's interior. His intimate knowledge of cold weather survival and wildlife behavior had made him a valuable asset to the base's operations, despite his junior rank and limited military experience. The scraping sound continued intermittently, accompanied by what Tyler could only describe as heavy breathing or snorting. He approached the door's window, wiping away the frost that had accumulated on the interior surface, and peered out into the swirling white chaos. The exterior lighting provided minimal illumination, creating strange shadows and distortions that made it difficult to distinguish between wind-blown snow and actual movement. Senior Airman Rebecca Ann Martinez, a 26-year-old medical technician from Phoenix, Arizona, was preparing emergency medical supplies in the base clinic when she received an unusual radio transmission. Rebecca had completed her emergency medical technician training at the University of Arizona before enlisting, and her 4 years of military service had included specialized training in cold weather injuries and trauma care. Her medical bag contained advanced life support equipment, including IV fluids, warmed to body temperature, emergency medications, and specialized bandages designed for extreme cold conditions. "Medical, this is base operations," the voice crackled through her radio. "We have reports of large animal tracks near several perimeter buildings. Request medical standby for potential wildlife encounter." Rebecca immediately began reviewing the base's medical protocols for animal attacks, a section of the emergency procedures manual that was rarely referenced but meticulously maintained. The protocols outlined treatment procedures for various types of trauma, including crushing injuries, lacerations, and puncture wounds. The manual specifically noted that polar bear attacks typically resulted in severe head and neck injuries due to the animal's tendency to target the victim's skull and spine. At precisely 0412 hours, Airman First Class David Paul Schneider, a 24-year-old aircraft mechanic from Wisconsin, was conducting pre-flight inspections on a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft when he observed movement near the aircraft parking area. David, whose grandfather had been a commercial fisherman on Lake Superior, possessed the keen observational skills that came from a lifetime of watching for subtle changes in weather and environment. The movement was too large and too deliberate to be wind-blown debris, and it appeared to be moving with purpose rather than being buffeted by the storm. David activated his tactical flashlight and directed the beam toward the source of the movement. The light revealed a massive white form moving between the parked aircraft with surprising stealth for something of its size. The creature appeared to be investigating the various vehicles and equipment scattered around the flight line, occasionally pausing to sniff at specific locations where human activity had been concentrated. "Holy shit!" David whispered, his breath forming ice crystals in the frigid air. He had grown up in northern Wisconsin's logging country and had encountered black bears on multiple occasions, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer size and presence of the creature he was observing. The animal appeared to be nearly 10 feet in length and stood approximately 4 feet at the shoulder, with a massive head that seemed disproportionately large, even for its enormous body. Captain William Robert Harrison, a 32-year-old pilot from Virginia, was reviewing weather reports in the Flight Operations Center when David's radio transmission interrupted his pre-flight briefing. William, whose father had been a Navy pilot during the Gulf War, had accumulated over 2,000 flight hours in various military aircraft and had experience operating in some of the world's most challenging environments. His current mission involved transporting critical supplies to a remote research station approximately 400 miles northeast of Thule, but the deteriorating weather conditions were making the flight increasingly dangerous. "Operations, this is Schneider at the flight line," David's voice crackled through the radio system. "I have visual contact with what appears to be a large polar bear investigating aircraft in the parking area. The animal is approximately 50 meters from tail number 08-3175 and appears to be moving toward the operations building." William immediately consulted the base's emergency response checklist, flipping to the section dedicated to wildlife encounters. The protocols outlined a series of escalating responses, beginning with passive observation and potentially culminating in the use of lethal force if the animal posed an imminent threat to personnel or critical infrastructure. The manual emphasized that polar bears were unpredictable and potentially aggressive, particularly during periods of environmental stress, such as severe weather events. Technical Sergeant Amanda Rose Foster, a 31-year-old intelligence analyst from Oregon, was monitoring communications intercepts in the Intelligence Operations Center when she overheard the developing wildlife situation on the base radio network. Amanda, whose analytical training had taught her to identify patterns and assess developing threats, immediately recognized that the scattered reports of animal tracks and sightings represented a potentially serious security situation. Her computer workstation provided access to extensive databases of intelligence information, including detailed studies of Arctic wildlife behavior and historical records of human-wildlife conflicts in Greenland. Amanda quickly accessed the National Weather Service's long-range forecast models and cross-referenced them with historical data on polar bear behavior during severe weather events. The analysis revealed that extreme winter storms often disrupted the normal feeding patterns of Arctic predators, potentially driving them to investigate human settlements in search of food sources. The combination of the current storm's intensity and its duration suggested that local wildlife might be experiencing significant stress, increasing the likelihood of aggressive or unpredictable behavior. At 0419 hours, the base's central alarm system activated with a series of sharp, penetrating tones that could be heard throughout the installation despite the howling wind. The alarm indicated a wildlife alert, level 2, which required all non-essential personnel to remain in secure buildings and directed security forces to implement enhanced protective measures. Master Sergeant Campbell, who was still tracking the mysterious prints in the snow, immediately altered her patrol route to converge on the area where the animal had been sighted. The tracks she had been following showed clear evidence of the creature's movement toward the base's central compound, passing within 50 meters of several critical facilities, including the power generation plant and the communications center. The prints indicated that the animal was moving with deliberation rather than wandering randomly, suggesting either familiarity with the area or the presence of attractants that were drawing it towards specific locations. Sergeant First Class Robert Anthony Kowalski, Jennifer's older brother, who was serving his second deployment at Thule as a combat engineer, was supervising emergency generator operations when he received word of the wildlife alert. Robert, whose 8 years of military service had included specialized training in force protection and emergency response, immediately implemented the base's lockdown procedures for his section. The power generation facility contained critical infrastructure that could not be compromised, and the presence of a large predator in the immediate vicinity posed a significant threat to operational security. The generators were housed in a steel-reinforced concrete building designed to withstand extreme weather conditions, but Robert was concerned about the numerous access points and ventilation systems that could potentially allow entry by a determined animal. He directed his 3-person team to conduct a thorough inspection of all entry points while maintaining continuous communication with base security forces. Airman First Class Christopher Lee Davidson, a 23-year-old weather observer from Kansas, was collecting meteorological data from the automated weather station when he observed the polar bear approaching his location. Christopher, whose passion for meteorology had led him to pursue specialized training in Arctic weather systems, was stationed in a small observation post approximately 200 meters from the main compound. The post's windows provided an unobstructed view of the surrounding terrain, making it an ideal location for wildlife observation despite its isolation. The bear was moving directly toward his position, and Christopher could see details that had been obscured by distance and weather conditions in previous sightings. The animal was enormous, clearly a mature male, based on its size, and the massive ridge of muscle across its shoulders. Its fur appeared yellowish-white rather than the pure white typically associated with polar bears, suggesting it had been feeding on seals and other marine mammals. Most disturbing was the animal's behavior, which seemed purposeful rather than the random wandering typically associated with bears investigating new territory. Base operations. This is Weather Station Alpha, Christopher transmitted, trying to keep his voice steady despite his growing anxiety. I have a polar bear approximately 30 meters from my position and closing. The animal appears to be investigating this facility specifically. Request immediate assistance. The weather station was constructed of lightweight materials designed for easy assembly and disassembly, offering minimal protection against a determined predator. Christopher's emergency procedures required him to maintain his post unless directly threatened, but the approaching bear was rapidly closing the distance between them. He could hear heavy breathing and occasional grunting sounds even over the wind, indicating that the animal was aware of his presence and potentially interested in investigating further. Major Sarah Elizabeth Thornton, the base's deputy commander for operations, was coordinating the emergency response from the command center when reports began flooding in from multiple locations simultaneously. Sarah, whose 15 years of military service had included command positions at installations around the world, had never encountered a situation involving a large predator infiltrating a secure military facility. Her training had prepared her for numerous emergency scenarios, but wildlife attacks were considered such a remote possibility that they received minimal attention during standard preparedness exercises. The command center's communication system was receiving reports from at least 6 different locations, all describing encounters with what appeared to be the same animal. The pattern of sightings suggested that the bear was conducting a systematic investigation of the base's perimeter, possibly seeking shelter from the storm or attracted by human scents and activities. The animal's behavior was concerning because it indicated a lack of fear toward humans, which often preceded aggressive encounters. At 0427 hours, the situation escalated dramatically when Airman Morrison reported that something was attempting to breach the entrance to Warehouse 7. The scraping sounds he had heard earlier had intensified, and he could now see claw marks appearing on the metal door as the animal tested its structural integrity. Tyler had barricaded himself inside the facility's office area, using heavy equipment crates to block the interior doors, but he was acutely aware that the building's construction would provide minimal protection against a determined polar bear. "This is Morrison in Warehouse 7, Tyler transmitted, his voice tight with controlled fear. "I have confirmed polar bear contact. The animal is attempting to breach the main entrance. The door is showing signs of structural damage, and I don't think it's going to hold much longer." The warehouse contained critical supplies, including emergency food rations, medical equipment, and cold weather gear that would be essential if the storm continued for several more days. More importantly, Tyler was trapped inside with limited escape options and no immediate backup available due to the ongoing blizzard. The building's emergency exits were located on the opposite side of the structure, requiring him to traverse the main warehouse floor where the bear would likely be able to access if it succeeded in breaching the primary entrance. Master Sergeant Campbell was responding to Tyler's location when she encountered the polar bear directly. The massive predator emerged from the swirling snow approximately 25 meters in front of her, moving with surprising speed and agility despite the deep snow and challenging conditions. Patricia's immediate assessment was that this was the largest polar bear she had ever seen, even in photographs or documentaries. The animal stood nearly 5 feet at the shoulder and appeared to weigh well over 1,000 pounds. "Control. Rover 1 has direct visual contact with the bear," Patricia transmitted, while slowly backing away from the animal. "Estimated size is adult male, approximately 10 feet in length. The animal has noticed my presence and appears to be evaluating whether I represent a threat or opportunity." The bear's behavior was unlike anything described in her training materials. Instead of fleeing or showing typical wildlife avoidance behaviors, the animal seemed curious about her presence. It approached to within 15 meters before stopping, rising onto its hind legs to gain a better view of the surrounding area. Standing upright, the bear appeared to be nearly 8 feet tall, with foreclaws that extended like massive daggers from its front paws. Patricia's standard equipment included a .40 caliber service pistol and pepper spray specifically designed for bear encounters, but she was acutely aware that both options would be minimally effective against an animal of this size and determination. Her tactical training emphasized avoiding confrontation whenever possible, but the bear's position between her and the base's secure buildings limited her options for withdrawal. The wind suddenly shifted, carrying Patricia's scent directly toward the bear, which immediately focused its attention on her location. The animal's demeanor changed noticeably, transitioning from curious investigation to what appeared to be predatory interest. Its head lowered, ears flattened against its skull, and it began advancing with the purposeful gait that wildlife experts recognized as preceding an attack. "Control, Rover 1. I need immediate backup at my location," Patricia transmitted, her voice remaining steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "The bear is exhibiting aggressive behavior and advancing on my position. I am approximately 100 meters southeast of Warehouse 7. Sergeant Thompson was coordinating multiple emergency responses from the central security desk when Patricia's transmission confirmed his worst fears. The base's emergency response protocols required him to notify higher headquarters of any incident involving injury or death of personnel. But the current communication difficulties caused by the storm made external contact challenging. More immediately, he needed to coordinate rescue efforts for both Patricia and Tyler, while ensuring that other personnel remained secure. The base's quick reaction force consisted of 4 security forces, personnel armed with standard military weapons, but none of them had specific training or equipment for dealing with large predators. Their standard ammunition was designed for engaging human targets at moderate ranges and would likely be insufficient for stopping a charging polar bear. The base's armory contained more powerful weapons, including rifles chambered for larger calibers, but accessing and deploying them would require several minutes that might not be available. At 0433 hours, the polar bear made its first direct assault on base infrastructure when it successfully breached the door to Warehouse 7. Tyler heard the metal door tear from its hinges with a grinding crash that was audible even over the storm's fury. The bear's massive form filled the doorway as it pushed through the opening, pausing momentarily to assess the interior space before beginning a methodical investigation of the warehouse's contents. Tyler remained hidden in the office area, listening to the sounds of the bear investigating the warehouse floor. He could hear heavy breathing, occasional grunting, and the crash of equipment being knocked over as the animal moved through the space. The bear appeared to be following scent trails, possibly attracted by emergency food rations or other organic materials stored in the facility. "Morrison to all stations," Tyler whispered into his radio. "The bear has breached Warehouse 7 and is inside the building with me. I'm secure in the office area for now, but the interior doors won't hold if the bear decides to investigate this section." The office area's construction was typical of military auxiliary buildings with hollow-core doors and drywall partitions that would provide minimal resistance to a determined predator. Tyler's survival training had included basic information about bear encounters, emphasizing the importance of avoiding direct confrontation and making oneself appear non-threatening. But those guidelines seemed inadequate when dealing with an animal that had already demonstrated its willingness to breach human structures. Staff Sergeant Reeves and Airman Kowalski had reached the communications building when they received word of the escalating situation. Daniel immediately began implementing emergency communication protocols, establishing contact with regional military headquarters to request assistance and notify higher command of the developing crisis. The storm was interfering with satellite communications, but he was able to establish intermittent radio contact with Thule's parent unit at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. "Peterson Base, this is Thule Operations," Daniel transmitted during a brief break in the atmospheric interference. "We have a code-red wildlife emergency involving a large polar bear that has breached base security and is currently threatening personnel. Request immediate guidance and possible emergency response assets." The response from Peterson Base was fragmented due to the communication difficulties, but Daniel was able to confirm that regional authorities had been notified and that emergency response assets would be dispatched as soon as weather conditions permitted. However, the current storm system extended across most of the North Atlantic, making immediate external assistance unlikely. Jennifer was monitoring radar systems when she detected unusual movement patterns that might indicate the presence of search and rescue aircraft in the area. The base's radar capabilities were sophisticated enough to track small aircraft at considerable distances, but the storm was creating significant interference that made positive identification difficult. She spent several minutes analyzing the returns before concluding that the contacts were likely weather-related phenomena rather than actual aircraft. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez had secured the communication equipment and was preparing to assist with the emergency response when he received a radio transmission that made his blood run cold. His daughter Sophia was scheduled to call him at 0500 hours as part of their regular communication schedule, and the thought of missing that call because of a bear attack seemed surreal. "Rodriguez, report to the armory immediately," came the transmission from Sergeant Thompson. "We need someone with weapons expertise to assist with emergency equipment deployment." Michael's maintenance background included extensive training with various military weapons systems, and he was qualified to operate several different types of firearms. The base's armory contained hunting rifles and shotguns that were occasionally used for wildlife control, though they had never been deployed against a predator as large as a polar bear. The armory was located in Building 1099, approximately 150 meters from the communications center where Michael was currently stationed. The route required traversing open ground that would expose him to both the storm and the potential presence of the bear, which was reported to be moving freely around the base perimeter. His cold weather gear would provide some protection against the elements, but would offer no defense against a polar bear attack. At 0441 hours, Master Sergeant Campbell made the decision that would ultimately save several lives while putting her own at maximum risk. Rather than continuing to retreat from the approaching bear, she chose to advance toward Warehouse 7 in an attempt to distract the animal from Tyler's location. Patricia's tactical experience had taught her that sometimes the best defense was a carefully calculated offense, and she recognized that Tyler's survival might depend on drawing the bear's attention away from the warehouse. Control. Rover 1 is going to attempt to draw the bear away from Warehouse 7, she transmitted, while checking her equipment one final time. If this goes badly, make sure my family knows I was doing my job. Patricia's approach required her to move across approximately 75 meters of open ground while maintaining visual contact with a predator that could cover that distance in less than 10 seconds. Her strategy involved making enough noise and movement to attract the bear's attention while positioning herself near structures that might provide cover or concealment if the situation deteriorated. The bear's reaction was immediate and decisive. Upon detecting Patricia's approach, it abandoned its investigation of the warehouse and began moving toward her with the fluid, powerful gait that characterized polar bear locomotion. Even in deep snow and adverse conditions, the animal moved with surprising speed and grace, its massive paws distributing its weight effectively across the snow surface. Patricia had approximately 15 seconds to reach cover before the bear would be able to engage her directly. Her destination was a concrete utility building that housed electrical switching equipment with solid walls that might provide protection and multiple exit points that could allow her to continue evading the animal. The distance to the building was approximately 30 meters. Manageable under normal conditions but challenging while wearing heavy cold weather gear and traversing difficult terrain. The bear reached the warehouse entrance at the same moment Patricia achieved cover behind the utility building. Instead of pursuing her immediately, the animal paused and appeared to reassess the situation, turning its attention between Patricia's location and the warehouse where Tyler remained hidden. This behavior suggested a level of tactical thinking that was more sophisticated than typical wildlife encounters. Tyler used the momentary distraction to improve his defensive position within the warehouse. He moved deeper into the office area and barricaded the interior door with additional furniture and equipment, creating multiple layers of obstacles that would delay the bear's access if it decided to investigate his location. His survival now depended on remaining undetected until help arrived, or the bear lost interest and moved away from the area. At 0445 hours, the situation escalated beyond anyone's worst-case scenario when the polar bear demonstrated its ability to manipulate wheeled vehicles. David Schneider, who was still observing from the flight line, watched in amazement as the bear approached a parked Humvee and began investigating its exterior. The animal appeared particularly interested in the vehicle's tires and undercarriage, areas where human sense would be concentrated. "Operations, this is Schneider," David transmitted, hardly believing what he was witnessing. "The polar bear is investigating a Humvee near Building 1156. The animal appears to be trying to access the vehicle's interior." The bear's investigation of the Humvee quickly progressed from curiosity to aggression. Using its massive foreclaws, the animal began tearing at the vehicle's soft top covering, easily shredding the heavy canvas material designed to withstand extreme weather conditions. Within minutes, the bear had created an opening large enough to access the vehicle's interior, and it began methodically destroying the seats, dashboard, and electronic equipment. The destruction of the Humvee was concerning not only because of the vehicle's value, but because it demonstrated the bear's problem-solving abilities and its apparent lack of fear regarding human technology. Most wild animals would have been deterred by the unfamiliar sights, sounds, and smells associated with military vehicles, but this bear seemed to view them as objects to be investigated and potentially exploited. Captain Harrison was monitoring the situation from the Flight Operations Center when he made a decision that would prove crucial to the evening's events. Rather than remaining in the secure building as directed by emergency protocols, he chose to attempt reaching one of the base's helicopters to provide aerial reconnaissance and potential rescue support. His flight experience included extensive training in emergency response operations, and he recognized that an aerial perspective might be essential for coordinating ground-based rescue efforts. "Operations, this is Captain Harrison," he transmitted while gathering his flight gear. "I'm going to attempt reaching the helicopter pad to establish aerial reconnaissance capability. The weather is marginal, but visibility is better at altitude, and we need eyes on the entire situation." The helicopter pad was located approximately 200 meters from the Flight Operations Center, requiring Harrison to traverse open ground while potentially exposing himself to the bear's presence. However, the base's two UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters were equipped with thermal imaging systems and powerful searchlights that could be invaluable for tracking the bear's movements and coordinating rescue operations. Senior Airman Martinez had completed her preparation of emergency medical supplies when she received a transmission requesting her to establish a forward medical post closer to the developing crisis. Rebecca's medical training emphasized rapid response and early intervention in trauma cases, and she recognized that time would be critical if the bear injured any personnel. "Medical is moving to establish forward treatment capability in Building 1134, she transmitted while loading her equipment onto a wheeled cart. "I'll have advanced life support ready for immediate deployment." Building 1134 was strategically located near the center of the developing crisis, close enough to provide rapid medical response but sufficiently protected to serve as a secure treatment facility. Rebecca's equipment included trauma supplies specifically designed for treating severe lacerations, crushing injuries, and shock, all of which were associated with large predator attacks. The medical protocols for bear attacks emphasized controlling hemorrhage and maintaining airway patency, as these were the most immediate life-threatening complications. Rebecca's supplies included hemostatic bandages designed to promote rapid blood clotting, advanced airway management tools, and pain medications that could be administered under field conditions. At 0452 hours, the polar bear made its most aggressive move yet, approaching the communications building where Staff Sergeant Reeves and Airman Kowalski were maintaining contact with higher headquarters. The bear's approach was methodical and purposeful, suggesting it had identified the building as a location of particular interest, possibly due to the concentration of human activity and electronic equipment. Daniel observed the bear's approach through the building's reinforced windows, noting details that would prove crucial for subsequent wildlife management efforts. The animal showed clear signs of malnutrition despite its enormous size, with visible ribs and hip bones that suggested it had been unable to maintain its normal feeding pattern. This condition, combined with the stress of the ongoing storm, likely explained its aggressive behavior and willingness to investigate human structures. "Kowalski, we need to evacuate this building immediately," Daniel directed, beginning to shut down critical communication equipment in preparation for relocation. "The bear is heading directly for our location, and this building won't provide adequate protection." Jennifer quickly secured her radar monitoring equipment while maintaining communication with the various aircraft and personnel scattered around the base. Her technical training had emphasized the importance of maintaining continuous communication during emergency situations, but the approaching bear represented an immediate threat that superseded operational requirements. The communications building's construction was similar to other auxiliary structures on the base, with reinforced concrete walls but standard commercial doors and windows that would provide minimal resistance to a determined polar bear. The building's emergency exit opened onto the north side, which would require them to move away from the main compound, but might allow them to avoid direct contact with the bear. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez had reached the armory and was selecting appropriate weapons when he received word that the bear was approaching the communications center. Michael's weapons expertise included training with various hunting rifles, and he quickly selected a .300 Winchester Magnum rifle equipped with a high-power scope. The weapon was designed for taking large game at extended ranges and represented the most powerful firearm available in the base's inventory. Thompson, Rodriguez has acquired heavy weapons capability, Michael transmitted while loading the rifle and gathering additional ammunition. I'm moving to establish overwatch position with clear fields of fire around the communications building. The .300 Winchester Magnum fired a 180-grain bullet at approximately 2,960 feet per second, generating nearly 3,500 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. Wildlife experts considered this level of performance adequate for stopping large predators, though shot placement would be critical given the polar bear's size and the challenging conditions. Michael's plan involved establishing a firing position on the roof of Building 1089, which would provide an elevated perspective and clear lines of sight to the communications center. The building's access ladder was located on the exterior wall, requiring him to climb approximately 20 feet while carrying the rifle and additional equipment. At 0456 hours, the polar bear reached the communications building and began the same systematic investigation it had conducted at other locations. The animal circled the structure, paying particular attention to doors, windows, and ventilation openings where human scents were concentrated. Its behavior suggested experience with human structures, possibly gained during previous encounters with research stations or hunting camps in the region. Daniel and Jennifer had evacuated through the building's rear exit and were moving toward Building 1134, where Senior Airman Martinez was establishing the forward medical post. Their route required crossing approximately 100 meters of open ground while remaining concealed from the bear's location, a challenging task given the limited visibility and difficult terrain conditions. The bear's investigation of the communications building quickly escalated to aggressive testing of its structural integrity. Using its massive foreclaws, the animal began scratching at the building's exterior doors and windows, creating visible damage to the metal surfaces. The sound of claws against metal was audible over the storm's fury, creating an eerie soundtrack to the developing crisis. Tyler Morrison remained hidden in Warehouse 7's office area while monitoring the bear's activities through radio communications. His position provided relative safety as long as the bear remained focused on other targets, but he was acutely aware that the animal could return to complete its investigation of the warehouse at any time. His survival strategy involved remaining completely silent and motionless while other personnel drew the bear's attention away from his location. Master Sergeant Campbell had used the bear's distraction to improve her tactical position, moving to a location that provided better cover while maintaining visual contact with the animal. Patricia's security forces training had included basic wildlife encounter protocols, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for dealing with a predator that showed no fear of humans or human technology. Control Rover 1 has established overwatch position approximately 50 meters southeast of the communications building, she transmitted, while adjusting her equipment for optimal defensive capability. The bear is actively investigating the structure and appears to be testing entry points. Patricia's position provided clear lines of sight to multiple buildings, while offering several escape routes if the bear's attention shifted to her location. Her primary weapon remained the .40 caliber service pistol, which she knew would be inadequate for stopping a charging polar bear, but might serve to distract or discourage the animal in a critical situation. The base's emergency response protocols had reached their maximum activation level, with all available personnel implementing defensive measures, while coordinate elements worked to establish offensive capabilities. The situation had progressed beyond a simple wildlife encounter to a comprehensive security emergency that threatened multiple facilities and personnel. At 0501 hours, Captain Harrison successfully reached the helicopter pad and began pre-flight preparations on the base's primary UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter. The aircraft systems were designed to operate in extreme cold conditions, but the ongoing storm presented significant challenges for safe flight operations. Wind speeds were still gusting above 60 miles per hour, and visibility remained limited to fewer than 100 meters in most directions. Operations Harrison is attempting to establish aerial reconnaissance capability, he transmitted while conducting rapid pre-flight inspections. Weather conditions are marginal, but improving slightly. I should be able to get airborne in approximately 10 minutes. The helicopter's thermal imaging system would provide a significant advantage in tracking the bear's movements and coordinating ground-based response efforts. The aircraft was also equipped with powerful searchlights that could illuminate large areas during night operations, potentially revealing the bear's location even in the ongoing blizzard. Harrison's flight experience included extensive training in emergency response operations, and he had previously participated in search and rescue missions in challenging weather conditions. However, conducting flight operations while a large predator roamed freely around the airfield represented a unique combination of hazards that was not covered in standard training scenarios. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez had reached his overwatch position on Building 1089's roof when the polar bear made its most dramatic move of the evening. The massive predator abandoned its investigation of the communications building and began moving directly toward the cluster of personnel who had gathered near Building 1134. The bear's movement was purposeful and rapid, covering ground with the efficient gait that characterized polar bear locomotion. All stations, the bear is moving toward Building 1134, Michael transmitted while acquiring the target through his rifle's scope. I have a clear shot, but the range is approximately 150 meters in challenging conditions. The shot would require Michael to engage a moving target at moderate range while dealing with wind, snow, and limited visibility. His training had included extensive marksmanship instruction, but most of that experience involved static targets under controlled conditions. The consequences of missing or only wounding the bear could be catastrophic for the personnel in its path. Master Sergeant Campbell recognized that the bear's new course would bring it into direct contact with several base personnel who had limited options for escape or concealment. Her tactical assessment indicated that immediate action was necessary to prevent multiple casualties, even if that action increased her own personal risk. Control, Rover 1 is moving to intercept, Patricia transmitted while abandoning her concealed position. I'm going to try to draw the bear's attention and redirect its movement away from populated areas. Patricia's plan involved making herself a more attractive target than the group of personnel near Building 1134, potentially sacrificing her own safety to protect others. Her approach required moving across open ground while attracting the bear's attention through noise and movement, essentially inviting an attack on her position. The bear's reaction to Patricia's appearance was immediate and decisive. The massive predator altered its course and began advancing directly toward her location with increased speed and apparent aggression. Standing nearly 5 feet at the shoulder and weighing over 1,000 pounds, the bear presented an imposing sight even at a distance of 100 meters. At 0505 hours, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez made the decision to engage the polar bear with lethal force. His scope provided a clear view of the animal advancing on Master Sergeant Campbell's position, and his tactical assessment indicated that intervention was necessary to prevent serious injury or death. The range was approximately 125 meters, challenging but manageable given his marksmanship training and the weapon's capabilities. "Taking the shot," Michael transmitted while adjusting for wind and target movement. The 300 Winchester Magnum's report was audible throughout the base despite the storm's fury, a sharp crack that temporarily silenced all radio communications as everyone waited to observe the result. Michael's shot was well aimed, striking the bear in the left shoulder and causing the animal to stumble and roar with pain and fury. However, the wound was not immediately incapacitating. The bear recovered its footing and continued advancing toward Patricia's position, now displaying clear signs of aggression and pain that made it even more dangerous. Blood was visible against its white fur, creating a stark contrast that was clearly visible even in the limited lighting conditions. "Hit confirmed, but the bear is still mobile and advancing," Michael reported while chambering another round, preparing for follow-up shot. The wounded polar bear's behavior became increasingly erratic and aggressive. Instead of fleeing as most wounded animals would, it appeared to become more focused on reaching Patricia's location, possibly identifying her as the source of the threat it had just experienced. The animal's pace increased despite its injury, and it began making vocalizations that were unlike anything the base personnel had heard before. Patricia realized that her position was no longer tenable and began moving toward the nearest substantial cover, a concrete equipment shelter approximately 30 meters from her current location. The bear was closing the distance rapidly, and she estimated that she had perhaps 20 seconds before it would be able to engage her directly. "Rover 1 is displacing to secondary position," Patricia transmitted while moving as rapidly as possible through the deep snow. "The bear is wounded but still approaching. Estimate contact in 15 seconds. Her movement attracted the bear's attention even more intensely, and the animal's advance became a focused charge toward her location. Despite its wound, the polar bear demonstrated the impressive speed and agility that made it one of the Arctic's most formidable predators. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez acquired the bear in his scope for a second shot, but Patricia's movement had placed her dangerously close to his line of fire. The risk of hitting friendly personnel prevented him from engaging immediately, forcing him to wait for a clearer shot opportunity while watching the deadly chase unfold below. At 0507 hours, Master Sergeant Campbell reached the concrete shelter just as the polar bear closed to within 10 meters of her position. The structure provided solid protection on 3 sides, but left her exposed to attack from the front, essentially trapping her in a confined space with limited options for further movement. Her tactical situation had deteriorated to the point where direct confrontation with the bear was unavoidable. The polar bear paused at the entrance to the shelter, perhaps sensing that it had cornered its prey and could now approach more cautiously. Blood from its shoulder wound was clearly visible, and the animal's breathing appeared labored, suggesting that Rodriguez's shot had caused significant internal damage despite not immediately incapacitating the predator. Patricia drew her service weapon and prepared for what would likely be the most challenging engagement of her 23-year military career. The .40 caliber pistol contained 15 rounds of standard military ammunition, adequate for engaging human targets, but questionably effective against a 1,000-pound polar bear. Her training had emphasized shot placement and the importance of remaining calm under pressure, skills that would be tested to their absolute limit. Control? Rover 1 is in direct contact with the bear, Patricia transmitted, her voice remaining steady despite the desperate nature of her situation. I'm going to engage with my sidearm. If this doesn't work, make sure someone notifies my family. The bear began advancing into the shelter with the deliberate confidence of a predator that recognized it had achieved a tactical advantage. Its massive head filled most of the shelter's opening, and its eyes reflected the available light with an intensity that was both fascinating and terrifying. Patricia waited until the bear was within 6 feet before opening fire, aiming for the center of the animal's face in an attempt to damage the brain or spinal column. Her first shot struck the bear just below its left eye, causing it to recoil and shake its head violently. The second shot missed as the bear moved, but the third struck it in the nose, producing a spray of blood that was immediately visible. The wounded polar bear's reaction was explosive. Rather than retreating, it lunged forward with renewed aggression, its massive foreclaws extending toward Patricia's position. She fired 3 more rounds in rapid succession, all striking the animal in the head and neck area, but the bear continued its advance with seemingly unstoppable momentum. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez had a clear shot opportunity as the bear lunged toward Patricia's position. His second shot with the .300 Winchester Magnum struck the animal in the spine just behind its shoulders, causing immediate paralysis of its rear legs. The bear collapsed partially, its front legs still functional, but its ability to coordinate movement severely compromised. "Second hit confirmed," Michael reported. "The bear is down but still alive and potentially dangerous." The partially paralyzed polar bear continued trying to reach Patricia's position, dragging itself forward with its front legs while making vocalizations that expressed both pain and fury. Blood from multiple wounds was creating a spreading stain in the snow around the shelter, but the animal's determination to reach its perceived enemy remained undiminished. Patricia remained in position while emptying the remainder of her pistol's magazine into the bear at close range. Several of her shots struck vital areas, but the animal's massive size and thick skull made immediate incapacitation difficult to achieve. Even with multiple gunshot wounds, the bear continued its efforts to reach her for nearly 3 minutes before finally succumbing to blood loss and trauma. At 05:12 hours, Master Sergeant Campbell transmitted the words that everyone on the base had been desperately hoping to hear. "Control Rover 1. The bear is down and appears to be deceased. I am uninjured, but need assistance clearing the area and securing the scene." The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the base personnel still faced significant challenges. The storm continued, with undiminished intensity, making movement around the installation dangerous and potentially exposing additional personnel to injury or exposure. The bear's carcass needed to be removed from its current location, and the various damaged facilities required assessment and repair. Captain Harrison had successfully launched the UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter despite the challenging weather conditions and was providing aerial reconnaissance of the base perimeter. His thermal imaging systems revealed no additional wildlife in the immediate area, suggesting that the deceased polar bear had been operating alone rather than as part of a group. "Aerial reconnaissance shows the immediate area is clear," Harrison reported. "No additional heat signatures or unusual activity detected around the base perimeter. Weather conditions are beginning to improve slightly, with visibility increasing to approximately 200 meters. Senior Airman Martinez had established her forward medical post and was prepared to treat any injuries resulting from the bear encounter. Rebecca's examination of Master Sergeant Campbell revealed minor exposure-related issues, but no serious injuries, a remarkable outcome given the intensity of the confrontation. Tyler Morrison was extracted from Warehouse 7 without incident, though his psychological condition showed clear signs of stress related to his extended period of hiding while the bear investigated his location. His knowledge of Arctic wildlife had helped him remain calm during the crisis, but the experience of being trapped in a building with a large predator had been profoundly disturbing. The base's emergency response had been largely successful in preventing casualties, but the incident exposed significant gaps in their wildlife management protocols. The existing procedures had assumed that polar bear encounters would be rare and relatively passive, rather than involving an aggressive predator that was willing to breach secure facilities and confront armed personnel. At 0530 hours, base personnel began the complex process of securing the scene and documenting the incident for subsequent investigation. The polar bear's carcass was estimated to weigh approximately 1,200 pounds and measured nearly 10 feet from nose to tail, making it one of the largest polar bears on record for the region. Wildlife biologists would later determine that the animal was a mature male, approximately 12 years old, that had been separated from its normal territory by unusual ice conditions in the surrounding waters. The bear's aggressive behavior was attributed to a combination of factors, including malnutrition, environmental stress caused by the storm, and possible previous negative encounters with humans that had conditioned it to view human settlements as sources of food or shelter. The animal's willingness to breach secure facilities and confront armed personnel was highly unusual and suggested desperation rather than typical predatory behavior. Staff Sergeant Reeves and Airman Kowalski were able to re-establish full communication capabilities within 45 minutes of the bear's death, restoring contact with higher headquarters and coordinating the arrival of investigation teams that would analyze the incident. Daniel's quick thinking in maintaining communication links during the crisis had been crucial for coordinating the emergency response and preventing additional casualties. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez's marksmanship had been instrumental in neutralizing the threat while minimizing risk to base personnel. His decision to engage the bear with lethal force had been difficult but necessary, and his accuracy under challenging conditions had prevented what could have been multiple casualties. The incident would later be used as a case study for wildlife encounter training at other Arctic installations. The base's medical facilities were capable of handling trauma cases, but the nearest civilian hospital was located over 400 miles away, making external medical evacuation difficult during the ongoing storm. Senior Airman Martinez's preparation of forward medical capabilities had been prescient, though fortunately no serious injuries occurred during the incident. Major Thornton coordinated the post-incident activities from the command center, ensuring that all personnel were accounted for and that damaged facilities were secured. The incident had tested the base's emergency response capabilities to their limits, revealing both strengths and areas for improvement in their procedures. The psychological impact of the bear attack would prove to be longer lasting than the physical damage to base facilities. Several personnel reported difficulty sleeping and increased anxiety about outdoor activities, symptoms consistent with trauma-related stress reactions. The base's mental health resources were activated to provide counseling and support for affected personnel. Wildlife experts from the Danish Environmental Protection Agency arrived at Thule Air Base 3 days after the incident to conduct a thorough investigation of the polar bear encounter. Dr. Lars Anderson, a wildlife biologist with 30 years of experience studying Arctic predators, led the investigative team that examined the bear's carcass and analyzed the circumstances that had led to the attack. This appears to have been an exceptional case involving multiple stressors that created highly unusual behavior patterns, Dr. Anderson explained during his preliminary briefing. The combination of severe weather, limited food availability, and possible previous human contact created conditions that are rarely seen in polar bear populations. The necropsy examination revealed that the bear had been in poor nutritional condition despite its impressive size, with fat reserves that were significantly below normal levels for a male of its age. Stomach contents included unusual items such as plastic fragments and metal debris, suggesting that the animal had been consuming non-food items in an attempt to satisfy its hunger. Tissue samples were sent to laboratories in Denmark and the United States for detailed analysis, including tests for environmental contaminants, disease organisms, and genetic markers that might explain the bear's aggressive behavior. The results would not be available for several weeks, but preliminary examinations suggested that the animal had been healthy, apart from its nutritional deficiencies. The base's damaged facilities required extensive repairs that would take several months to complete. Warehouse 7's main entrance needed complete replacement, and several vehicles required significant bodywork to repair damage caused by the bear's claws. The total repair costs were estimated at over $200,000, not including the value of destroyed equipment and supplies. More significantly, the incident prompted a comprehensive review of wildlife management protocols at all U.S. military installations in the Arctic region. The Department of Defense established a working group to develop enhanced procedures for preventing and responding to large predator encounters, drawing on expertise from wildlife agencies, military personnel, and academic researchers. The working group's recommendations included improved perimeter monitoring systems, enhanced training for security forces, and the deployment of specialized equipment designed for wildlife control. Several installations would receive upgraded weapons specifically chosen for their effectiveness against large predators, along with training programs that would prepare personnel for encounters similar to the one that had occurred at Thule. Airman Morrison received commendations for his calm and professional behavior during the crisis, particularly his ability to remain hidden while the bear investigated Warehouse 7. His knowledge of Arctic wildlife, gained through his Alaska upbringing, had contributed significantly to his survival and was recognized as a valuable asset for the base's future operations. Master Sergeant Campbell was awarded the Air Force Commendation Medal for her actions during the bear encounter, specifically her decision to place herself at risk in order to protect other personnel. Her tactical thinking and courage under pressure had been instrumental in preventing casualties, and her experience would be incorporated into training programs for security forces at other installations. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez received similar recognition for his marksmanship and decision-making during the crisis. His ability to engage a moving target under challenging conditions while ensuring the safety of friendly personnel demonstrated exceptional skill and professionalism. The incident would become a standard case study in the military's advanced marksmanship training programs. The psychological counseling provided to base personnel revealed that the incident had affected individuals differently depending on their previous experience with wildlife and their role during the crisis. Personnel who had been directly threatened by the bear showed more significant stress reactions than those who had observed the events from secure locations. Dr. Maria Santos, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma-related disorders, was brought to Thule Air Base to provide specialized counseling services for affected personnel. Her assessment indicated that most individuals would recover fully from their stress reactions within several months, though some might experience longer-term effects that would require ongoing treatment. The human mind is remarkably resilient, but encounters with large predators trigger very primitive fear responses that can persist long after the immediate threat has passed, Dr. Santos explained. The key to recovery is processing the experience in a supportive environment while gradually re-establishing confidence in one's ability to handle threatening situations. The base's chaplain services were also activated to provide spiritual counseling for personnel who were struggling with existential questions raised by their brush with death. Several individuals reported difficulty understanding how such a random and dangerous event could occur, leading to concerns about their safety and mortality that extended beyond the immediate incident. The media attention generated by the polar bear attack was significant but carefully managed by military public affairs personnel. Initial reports focused on the unusual nature of the incident and the successful response by base personnel, avoiding details that might compromise operational security or reveal vulnerabilities in the installation's defenses. Environmental groups seized on the incident as evidence of climate change impacts on Arctic wildlife populations, arguing that changing ice conditions were forcing polar bears to seek food and shelter in areas previously avoided. This interpretation was disputed by some wildlife experts who noted that aggressive encounters between humans and polar bears had been documented throughout recorded history. The incident prompted renewed debate about the military's presence in environmentally sensitive Arctic regions, with some critics arguing that installations like Thule Air Base represented unwelcome intrusions into pristine wilderness areas. Military officials countered that these facilities served critical national security functions and that environmental impacts were carefully monitored and minimized. 3 months after the attack, Thule Air Base had implemented numerous changes designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. The installation's perimeter monitoring system was upgraded with motion sensors and thermal cameras specifically designed to detect large wildlife, providing early warning of potential threats. The base's armory received specialized weapons and ammunition selected for their effectiveness against large predators, along with training programs that prepared security forces for wildlife encounters. Personnel assigned to outdoor duties were provided with enhanced personal protection equipment, including bear spray and communication devices that could summon immediate assistance. Wildlife management protocols were completely rewritten to reflect lessons learned from the polar bear incident. The new procedures emphasized prevention through improved food storage and waste management, along with rapid response capabilities that could neutralize threats before they escalated to dangerous levels. The base's medical facilities were enhanced with additional trauma care equipment and supplies specifically chosen for treating injuries associated with large predator attacks. Medical personnel received specialized training in wound management and emergency procedures related to animal encounters. 6 months later, a comprehensive after-action report was published that documented every aspect of the polar bear incident and the lessons learned from the experience. The report was distributed to military installations worldwide and became required reading for security forces and command personnel assigned to remote locations. The report's conclusions emphasized the importance of expecting the unexpected in remote military operations, noting that even well-prepared installations could face threats that fell outside their normal planning assumptions. The successful outcome of the Thule incident was attributed to the professionalism and adaptability of the personnel involved, who had responded effectively to a situation for which they had received minimal specific training. 1 year after the attack, Thule Air Base conducted a comprehensive exercise designed to test their enhanced wildlife management protocols. The exercise simulated multiple scenarios involving large predators and evaluated the effectiveness of the new equipment, training, and procedures that had been implemented following the polar bear incident. The exercise results indicated significant improvements in the base's capability to prevent and respond to wildlife threats. Though some areas for further improvement were identified, personnel performance was generally excellent, with individuals demonstrating both technical competence and the kind of clear thinking under pressure that had characterized the original incident response. Master Sergeant Campbell had been promoted and transferred to a security forces training facility where she developed curriculum based on her experience with the polar bear encounter. Her first-hand knowledge of facing a large predator under combat conditions was considered invaluable for preparing other military personnel who might face similar threats. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez completed his deployment and returned to his family in San Antonio, where he was celebrated as a hero by local media and veterans organizations. His marksmanship during the polar bear incident had become legendary within military circles, and he was frequently invited to speak at training events and professional conferences. The incident's impact extended far beyond Thule Air Base, influencing wildlife management policies at military installations around the world. Bases in Alaska, Canada, and Northern Europe all implemented enhanced protocols based on lessons learned from the polar bear attack, recognizing that climate change and habitat disruption were increasing the likelihood of similar encounters. 2 years later, researchers published a comprehensive study of the Thule polar bear incident in the Journal of Wildlife Management, analyzing the factors that had contributed to the attack and evaluating the effectiveness of the response. The study became a seminal work in the field of human-wildlife conflict management and was cited extensively in subsequent research. The bear's carcass had been preserved and was eventually transferred to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History, where it became part of a permanent exhibit on Arctic wildlife and climate change. The display included detailed information about the Thule incident and its significance for understanding human-wildlife interactions in changing Arctic environments. Environmental monitoring data collected before and after the incident revealed subtle changes in local wildlife populations, suggesting that the bear's presence at Thule had been part of broader ecological disruptions affecting the region. These changes were consistent with patterns observed elsewhere in the Arctic, where traditional wildlife behavior was being altered by environmental pressures. The psychological impact of the incident continued to influence personnel decisions and training programs years after the attack. Several individuals who had been present during the crisis chose to specialize in wildlife management or environmental protection, viewing their experience as a calling to work on conservation issues. Dr. Anderson's final report on the incident, published 3 years later, concluded that the Thule polar bear attack represented a unique convergence of environmental, behavioral, and situational factors that were unlikely to be repeated in exactly the same way. However, he warned that similar incidents should be expected as Arctic ecosystems continued to experience stress from climate change and human encroachment. The base itself had become something of a pilgrimage site for wildlife researchers and military personnel interested in human-wildlife conflict management. The concrete shelter where Master Sergeant Campbell had made her final stand against the bear was preserved as an informal memorial with a small plaque commemorating the incident and the courage of those involved. Staff Sergeant Reeves was promoted and assigned to a communications training facility where he developed protocols for maintaining operational capability during wildlife emergencies. His experience in coordinating multiple communication links during the crisis had revealed the critical importance of reliable information flow during complex emergency situations. Airman Kowalski completed her enlistment and used her military training to pursue a degree in environmental science, ultimately specializing in Arctic ecology and wildlife behavior. Her experience during the polar bear incident had sparked a lifelong interest in understanding the complex relationships between human activities and wildlife populations in extreme environments. The incident had also influenced broader military doctrine regarding environmental threats, with new policies requiring installations in sensitive ecological areas to conduct regular assessments of potential wildlife conflicts. These assessments became part of standard operational planning, ensuring that wildlife management considerations were integrated into all aspects of base operations. 5 years after the attack, a documentary film crew visited Thule Air Base to produce a comprehensive account of the polar bear incident for educational and historical purposes. The film featured interviews with key personnel and expert analysis of the factors that had contributed to both the attack and the successful response. The documentary, titled Arctic Siege: The Thule Polar Bear Attack, received widespread distribution and was used in wildlife management training programs around the world. It effectively captured both the drama of the incident and its broader significance for understanding human-wildlife conflicts in an era of environmental change. Captain Harrison, who had provided crucial aerial reconnaissance during the crisis, was promoted to major and assigned to a search and rescue squadron where his experience with emergency flight operations in extreme conditions proved invaluable. His decision to launch the helicopter despite dangerous weather conditions was later recognized as a critical factor in the incident's successful resolution. The base's current commander, Colonel Jennifer Walsh, regularly referenced the polar bear incident during leadership training sessions, using it as an example of how unexpected challenges could test an organization's adaptability and resilience. The incident had become part of Thule's institutional memory, influencing decision-making processes and emergency preparedness activities years after the original event. Senior Airman Martinez had been promoted and specialized in emergency medicine, ultimately becoming a physician assistant with expertise in trauma care and wilderness medicine. Her experience preparing for potential bear attack casualties had influenced her career path and her understanding of the critical importance of rapid medical response in remote locations. The scientific analysis of tissue samples from the bear had revealed elevated levels of environmental contaminants, including mercury and persistent organic pollutants, suggesting that chemical pollution was affecting Arctic wildlife populations in ways that might influence behavior. This discovery led to additional research on the relationship between environmental contamination and wildlife aggression. DNA analysis had revealed that the bear belonged to a genetically distinct subpopulation that was particularly vulnerable to environmental changes, adding another layer of scientific significance to the incident. Conservation biologists used this information to develop more targeted protection strategies for polar bear populations throughout the Arctic region. The incident's influence on military training extended to other services, with the Army, Navy, and Marines incorporating lessons learned from the Thule attack into their own wildlife encounter protocols. The inter-service cooperation that resulted from sharing this experience contributed to more comprehensive and effective wildlife management across all branches of the military. 10 years after the polar bear attack, Thule Air Base conducted a commemorative event honoring the personnel who had been involved in the incident. Master Sergeant Campbell, now retired and working as a wildlife management consultant, returned to the base to participate in the ceremony and share her reflections on the experience. That night taught us that we can never become complacent about the environment we work in, Campbell reflected during her address to current base personnel. The Arctic is beautiful and fascinating, but it's also unforgiving and unpredictable. Our survival depends on respecting that reality and being prepared for whatever challenges nature might present. The commemoration included the unveiling of a permanent display in the base museum that documented the incident and its aftermath, ensuring that future generations of personnel would understand the lessons learned from the polar bear encounter. The display featured artifacts from the incident, including the rifle that Technical Sergeant Rodriguez had used to neutralize the threat. Research based on the Thule incident had contributed to significant advances in understanding polar bear behavior and developing more effective management strategies for human-wildlife conflicts in Arctic environments. The comprehensive documentation of the attack had provided scientists with unprecedented detail about how large predators respond to environmental stresses and human activities. The base's enhanced wildlife management program had become a model for other military installations, with representatives from around the world visiting Thule to study their protocols and equipment. The program's success in preventing subsequent wildlife incidents had validated the investments made in improved monitoring and response capabilities. Environmental changes in the Arctic had continued to accelerate in the years following the incident, with sea ice extent reaching record lows and traditional polar bear habitat becoming increasingly fragmented. These changes had increased the frequency of human-wildlife encounters throughout the Arctic region, making the lessons learned from the Thule incident even more relevant and valuable. The psychological support systems developed in response to the incident had been refined and implemented at military installations worldwide, providing personnel with better resources for coping with traumatic experiences. The understanding that encounters with large predators could have lasting psychological effects had led to more comprehensive mental health programs for military personnel in remote locations. 15 years later, the Thule polar bear attack remained a landmark event in the study of human-wildlife conflicts, regularly cited in scientific literature and used as a case study in wildlife management courses around the world. The incident had demonstrated both the potential for catastrophic encounters between humans and large predators, and the importance of preparedness, training, and quick thinking in preventing casualties. The base itself had evolved significantly since the attack, with new construction projects incorporating wildlife deterrent features and enhanced security measures designed to prevent similar incidents. The lessons learned from the polar bear encounter had been integrated into every aspect of base operations, from facility design to personnel training to emergency response procedures. The broader implications of the incident for Arctic security and environmental protection continued to influence policy discussions at the highest levels of government. The attack had highlighted the complex relationships between national security interests, environmental protection, and climate change in one of the world's most sensitive ecological regions. As climate change continued to alter Arctic ecosystems, the relevance of the Thule polar bear incident only increased. The attack served as a stark reminder that human activities in the Arctic carried inherent risks and responsibilities, and that successful operations in these environments required careful consideration of both environmental factors and wildlife behavior. The legacy of December 14, 2025, lived on in the enhanced preparedness of military personnel worldwide, the improved understanding of polar bear behavior under stress, and the recognition that even the most remote and secure installations could face unexpected challenges that would test their adaptability and resolve. The 5 soldiers who had been threatened by the polar bear that night had survived to tell their story, but their experience served as a permanent reminder of the power and unpredictability of the Arctic environment that surrounded their isolated outpost at the top of the world. The next stories, July 15, 2025, Grizzly Malls, entire wedding party of 22 in Montana Lodge. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Gallatin Valley as Sarah Elizabeth Chen adjusted her wedding dress one final time in the ornate mirror of Pine Ridge Lodge's bridal suite. At 28, she had envisioned this day countless times, But never had she imagined it would unfold in such a remote corner of Montana, 37 miles southeast of Bozeman, along the winding Gallatin River. The lodge, a sprawling timber and stone structure built in 1987 by local contractor William "Bill" Hendricks, sat nestled against the Gallatin National Forest at an elevation of 4,200 feet, surrounded by dense stands of lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, and towering aspens that rustled in the gentle morning breeze. Sarah's mother, Linda Chen, 62, smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from her daughter's ivory silk gown, her weathered hands trembling slightly from a combination of emotion and the early morning chill that still lingered despite the July date. Linda had immigrated from Taiwan in 1978, meeting Sarah's father, Dr. Robert Chen, during his residency at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. The family had since established deep roots in Seattle, where Robert built a successful cardiothoracic surgery practice, while Linda taught Mandarin at the University of Washington. This wedding represented the culmination of their American dream, their only daughter marrying Marcus James Thompson, an environmental lawyer from Denver whose family had been ranching in Colorado for 4 generations. Marcus stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the lodge's master bedroom, adjusting his charcoal grey tuxedo while gazing out at the pristine wilderness that stretched endlessly toward the Madison Range. At 31, he possessed the lean, athletic build of someone who spent weekends scaling 14ers and navigating whitewater rapids. His sandy brown hair, still damp from his morning shower, caught the filtered sunlight as he watched a red-tailed hawk circle lazily above the meadow where the ceremony would take place in just 4 hours. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent the better part of 5 years fighting mining companies and logging operations to preserve exactly this kind of untouched habitat. And now he was celebrating the most important day of his life, surrounded by the very wilderness he'd dedicated his career to protecting. Jessica Marie Moore, Sarah's maid of honor and closest friend since their freshman year at Stanford University, bustled around the bridal suite with characteristic efficiency, her auburn hair pulled back in an elaborate updo that had taken the lodge's visiting stylist, Patricia "Patty" Summers, nearly 2 hours to perfect. Jessica, 29, worked as a pediatric nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital, a demanding job that had taught her to remain calm under pressure while maintaining an infectious optimism that had earned her the nickname Sunshine among her colleagues. She wore a flowing sage green bridesmaid dress that complemented her pale complexion and freckled cheeks, the color chosen specifically to blend harmoniously with the natural surroundings of the outdoor ceremony. The Pine Ridge Lodge had been selected after an exhaustive search that took Sarah and Marcus through dozens of venues across the Rocky Mountain region. They'd ultimately chosen this particular location not just for its breathtaking beauty, but for its intimate size. The main reception hall could accommodate exactly their guest list of 22 people, creating the perfect atmosphere for what they'd envisioned as an exclusive, family-focused celebration. The lodge's owner, Margaret "Maggie" Caldwell, 68, had inherited the property from her late husband Frank in 2019 and had been running it as a high-end wedding and retreat venue ever since. A former park ranger who'd spent 34 years with the National Park Service, Maggie possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the local ecosystem and had assured the couple that bear encounters, while possible, were extremely rare in the immediate vicinity of the lodge. The wedding party had arrived 3 days earlier, on Friday, July 12th, to take advantage of the lodge's all-inclusive package that included guided hiking, fly fishing on the Gallatin River, and evening campfires complete with s'mores and storytelling. Marcus's best man, his younger brother David Michael Thompson, 28, had driven up from Denver with his wife Kellyanne Thompson, 31, and their twin 6-year-old daughters, Emma Rose and Lily Grace. David worked as a civil engineer for the Colorado Department of Transportation, specializing in highway construction through sensitive environmental areas. A career choice that often put him at odds with his environmentalist brother, though their relationship remained strong despite their professional differences. Sarah's bridesmaids included her sister Amy Elizabeth Chen Rodriguez, 32, who'd flown in from Los Angeles with her husband Carlos Rodriguez, 34, and their 8-year-old son Tyler James Rodriguez. Amy worked as a financial analyst for a major investment firm, while Carlos taught high school biology in the Glendale Unified School District. Their son Tyler had been fascinated by the wildlife around the lodge, spending hours with his junior ranger guidebook, identifying bird species and learning about the local ecosystem from Maggie during their evening educational sessions around the fire pit. The second bridesmaid, Rachel Ann O'Connor, 27, was Sarah's former roommate from medical school at the University of Washington. Though Sarah had ultimately switched her focus to veterinary medicine, while Rachel completed her MD and was now serving her residency in emergency medicine at Harbor U CLA Medical Center. Rachel had arrived alone, having ended a long-term relationship just 6 months earlier, and had thrown herself into wedding preparation activities as a welcome distraction from her personal struggles. Her fiery red hair and pale Irish complexion made her a striking contrast to the other members of the wedding party, and her quick wit and medical knowledge had already made her popular with the diverse group of wedding guests. The third bridesmaid, Monica Grace Steinberg, 30, had been Sarah's veterinary school classmate and study partner, and now worked alongside her at the Bellevue Animal Hospital in Seattle. Monica's parents, Dr. Harold Steinberg, 65, and Ruth Steinberg, 62, had both flown in from Chicago, where Harold maintained a successful orthodontic practice, while Ruth worked as a social worker specializing in family crisis intervention. Monica's practical nature and calm demeanor had made her invaluable during the wedding planning process, and she'd taken charge of coordinating with the various vendors and ensuring that every detail was executed flawlessly. Marcus's groomsmen included his college roommate from the University of Colorado, James Patrick Jimmy Sullivan, 29, who'd built a successful outdoor gear company based in Boulder after graduating with a degree in business administration. Jimmy had arrived with his girlfriend of 2 years, Samantha Sam Louise Porter, 26, a freelance photographer who'd offered to serve as the wedding's unofficial documentation specialist, capturing candid moments throughout the weekend with her professional-grade Canon equipment. Sam's artistic eye had already produced stunning images of the pre-wedding activities, including a particularly memorable shot of the entire wedding party silhouetted against the sunset during their Thursday evening hike to Eagle's Nest Overlook. The second groomsman, Dr. Michael Anthony Brennan, 33, had been Marcus's law school study partner at University of Denver Sturm College of Law, and now worked as a prosecutor for the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office, specializing in environmental crimes and wildlife trafficking cases. His expertise had proven valuable during several conversations with the wedding guests about the legal complexities surrounding human-wildlife interactions in areas like the Gallatin Valley. Michael had arrived with his wife Jennifer Lynn Brennan, 31, a high school English teacher, and their 4-year-old daughter Sophia Marie Brennan, who'd quickly become Tyler Rodriguez's constant companion during their wilderness adventures. Sarah's parents had also invited Dr. Robert's younger brother Thomas Chen, 58, who'd driven up from Salt Lake City with his wife Barbara Chen, 55, and their college-age son Matthew Chen, 19, who was studying wildlife biology at Utah State University. Matthew's academic focus had made him particularly interested in learning about the grizzly bear population in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and he'd spent considerable time during their first 2 days at the lodge discussing bear behavior and habitat requirements with Maggie, who'd shared stories from her decades of experience in bear country. The final wedding guests, included Linda Chen's sister, Patricia Liu, 59, who travelled from Vancouver, British Columbia, with her husband Gerald Liu, 61, both of whom worked as professors at the University of British Columbia in the Department of Asian Studies. Their presence represented an important connection to the extended family's cultural heritage, and they'd brought traditional Chinese wedding gifts that would be formally presented during the evening reception. The lodge itself represented a masterpiece of rustic luxury architecture, constructed from locally harvested timber and Montana sandstone, with a distinctive green metal roof that had weathered to a subtle patina over its 38 years of existence. The main building featured soaring cathedral ceilings supported by massive log beams with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. The reception hall, where the evening's festivities would take place, occupied the entire eastern wing of the structure, with French doors opening onto a wraparound deck that overlooked the Gallatin River Valley. The interior featured a massive stone fireplace built from river rock, surrounded by comfortable seating areas furnished with handcrafted leather chairs and couches adorned with Pendleton wool blankets in earth tones that perfectly complemented the natural surroundings. The lodge's kitchen had been upgraded in 2021 to meet the demands of high-end catering, with commercial-grade appliances and preparation areas that could accommodate elaborate multi-course meals. The catering for Sarah and Marcus's wedding had been arranged through Bozeman's premier culinary service, Rocky Mountain Celebrations, owned and operated by chef Antoine Dubois, 45, a French-trained chef who'd relocated to Montana in 2018 after working in five-star restaurants in San Francisco and Seattle. Chef Dubois had arrived on Saturday morning with his team of 4 assistants, including sous chef Maria Esperanza Gutierrez, 38, pastry specialist Rebecca Becky Joe Matthews, 26, and servers Daniel Christopher Hayes, 24, and Ashley Nicole Thompson, 22, who was coincidentally a distant cousin of the groom, though they'd only discovered their family connection during the pre-wedding dinner preparations. The menu had been carefully planned to showcase Montana's finest ingredients while accommodating various dietary restrictions among the wedding party. The evening would begin with hors d'oeuvres featuring locally sourced trout, elk carpaccio, and artisanal cheeses from nearby Willow Creek Dairy, followed by a choice of grass-fed Montana beef tenderloin or pan-seared Rocky Mountain trout, accompanied by seasonal vegetables harvested from organic farms in the Gallatin Valley. The wedding cake, a 3-tier creation featuring huckleberry filling and vanilla bean buttercream frosting, had been decorated with sugar flowers that perfectly replicated the wildflowers blooming in the surrounding meadows. The ceremony itself had gone off without a single hitch, taking place at precisely 4 p.m. in the meadow behind the lodge, with the 22 guests seated in white wooden chairs arranged in a semicircle around the altar area that Marcus and Jimmy had constructed from aspen logs harvested from deadfall on the property. The Reverend Patricia Pat Williamson, 54, who'd driven down from her parish in Livingston, had delivered a heartfelt ceremony that incorporated both Christian traditions and elements of Chinese culture, honoring the diverse backgrounds represented in the union of the two families. The temperature had been perfect, a comfortable 72 degrees with a gentle breeze, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers across the assembled guests. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting the entire valley in a golden glow that photographers call the magic hour, the wedding party had moved indoors for the reception, which was scheduled to begin at 6:30 p.m. with cocktails and hors d'oeuvres, followed by dinner at 7:30 and dancing until midnight. The reception hall had been transformed into an elegant celebration space with round tables draped in crisp white linens and centerpieces featuring locally gathered wildflowers arranged in mason jars wrapped with burlap and lace. String lights had been hung from the exposed beam ceiling, creating a warm, romantic ambience that perfectly complemented the rustic elegance of the lodge's architecture. By 8:45 p.m., the reception was in full swing, with guests having finished their main courses and settling in for the traditional wedding toasts and speeches. The evening had been filled with laughter and heartfelt moments, including Dr. Robert Chen's emotional speech about watching his daughter grow from a curious child who brought home injured squirrels and baby birds into an accomplished veterinarian who dedicated her life to caring for animals. David Thompson had delivered a humorous best man speech recounting embarrassing stories from Marcus's childhood, including his disastrous attempt at age 12 to build a treehouse that had collapsed within hours of completion, foreshadowing his future career in environmental law rather than construction. The atmosphere had been further enhanced by Sam Porter's carefully curated playlist, featuring a mix of contemporary hits and classic romantic ballads that had successfully encouraged even the most reluctant dancers onto the makeshift dance floor that had been created by rolling back the lodge's antique Persian rugs. The bar, staffed by experienced bartender Craig Allen Martinez, 35, who'd driven over from Bozeman for the evening, had been serving a selection of Montana microbrews, carefully chosen wines from Pacific Northwest vineyards, and signature cocktails created specifically for the wedding, including a Gallatin Sunset featuring local huckleberry liqueur and champagne, and Marcus's Mountain, a whiskey-based drink that incorporated honey from beehives maintained on the lodge property. What none of the 22 wedding guests realized as they celebrated with increasing enthusiasm and alcohol-influenced abandon was that their festivities had been observed for the better part of 3 hours by a massive male grizzly bear that had been drawn to the area by the intoxicating combination of cooking aromas, human voices, and the bass vibrations from the sound system that had been reverberating through the ground and reaching his sensitive hearing from nearly a mile away. The bear, later designated as Bear Number 423 by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks investigators, was a 23-year-old male weighing approximately 700 pounds, standing 4 feet tall at the shoulder and measuring 8 feet from nose to tail when stretched to his full length. Bear Number 423 had been born in the spring of 2002 in a den located roughly 15 miles northeast of the Pine Ridge Lodge, in the high country near the Gallatin Range, to an 18-year-old sow designated as Bear Number 127 by wildlife researchers who'd been tracking the local grizzly population since the species was listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1975. As a cub, Number 423 had learned the essential survival skills from his mother during their 2.5 years together, including the critical ability to identify and exploit human food sources, a behavioral pattern that would ultimately prove both beneficial and catastrophic throughout his adult life. The Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which encompassed the area around Pine Ridge Lodge, supported a grizzly bear population that had recovered from a low of approximately 136 individuals in 1975 to an estimated 718 bears by 2019, according to data compiled by the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team. This population density, while representing a conservation success story, had also led to increased human-bear encounters as the animals expanded their range and competed for limited resources across a landscape that had been significantly altered by human development over the past century and a half. Bear Number 423 had first come to the attention of wildlife managers in 2018 when he'd been involved in a series of incidents at camping areas in Yellowstone National Park, approximately 60 miles south of the lodge. His behavior pattern indicated a learned association between human presence and food rewards, a dangerous combination that wildlife experts refer to as food conditioning. Despite multiple attempts at aversive conditioning using rubber bullets, bear spray, and relocation efforts, Number 4 23 had continued to seek out human food sources, demonstrating the remarkable intelligence and adaptability that made grizzly bears both successful survivors and potentially dangerous neighbors in areas where human activity overlapped with their natural habitat. The specific chain of events that would culminate in the tragic attack began 3 days earlier, on Friday, July 12th, when bear number 423 had detected the scent of cooking food drifting from the Pine Ridge Lodge kitchen during the wedding party's welcome dinner. The bear's olfactory system, capable of detecting odors from distances exceeding 20 miles under favorable wind conditions, had been stimulated by the complex bouquet of aromas emanating from Chef Dubois' elaborate meal preparation, including seared steaks, roasted vegetables, and the particularly enticing smell of bacon fat that had been used to cook the breakfast potatoes served during Saturday morning's pre-ceremony brunch. Throughout Saturday and Sunday, bear number 423 had maintained a cautious distance from the lodge, observing the increased human activity while remaining concealed in the dense forest that surrounded the property on 3 sides. His behavior during this period demonstrated the remarkable patience and intelligence that characterized adult male grizzlies in their prime, as he assessed the potential risks and rewards associated with approaching the source of the food odors that continued to intensify with each meal prepared in the lodge's kitchen. The bear's decision to approach the lodge on Monday evening had been influenced by several factors that had aligned to create what wildlife behaviorists would later describe as a perfect storm of circumstances. The wind direction had shifted from the prevailing westerly pattern to an easterly flow, carrying the scents from the reception directly toward the forest where bear number 423 had been waiting. The increased volume of human voices and music, rather than serving as a deterrent, had actually masked the bear's approach and prevented the wedding guests from hearing the subtle sounds that might have warned them of his presence. Additionally, the bear's hunger level had been elevated by the ongoing drought conditions that had persisted throughout the summer of 2025, reducing the availability of his preferred natural food sources, including whitebark pine nuts, berries, and the various roots and grasses that typically comprise the majority of a grizzly's diet. The Montana Department of Natural Resources had documented below-average precipitation levels throughout the Gallatin Valley region, with rainfall totals running approximately 35% below the historical average for the period from May through July, creating stressed conditions for wildlife across the ecosystem. At approximately 8:42 p.m., as the wedding reception reached its peak energy level, with guests dancing to an upbeat rendition of Sweet Caroline that had the entire group singing along enthusiastically, bear number 423 made his final approach toward the lodge through a narrow corridor of forest that provided natural concealment until he reached the edge of the cleared area surrounding the building. His massive frame moved with surprising stealth through the undergrowth, his broad paws making virtually no sound on the forest floor, despite his substantial weight. The bear's approach route took him along the northern side of the lodge, where the prevailing winds continued to carry the intoxicating sense of food and human activity directly toward his sensitive nostrils. His dark brown coat, nearly black in the dim evening light, provided perfect camouflage against the shadows cast by the towering pine trees that surrounded the property. Wildlife cameras later recovered by investigators would show that bear number 423 had paused at the forest edge for nearly 4 minutes, his massive head swaying from side to side as he processed the overwhelming sensory input from the human gathering just 30 yards away. The decision to attack appeared to have been triggered by a specific incident that occurred at exactly 8:46 p.m. when 8-year-old Tyler Rodriguez, who'd been growing restless during the adult conversation and dancing, convinced his 4-year-old cousin Sophia Brennan to join him in exploring the lodge's wraparound deck. The children had slipped away from their parents' supervision while the adults were distracted by the increasingly animated dancing and conversation that had accompanied the serving of the wedding cake and champagne toasts. Tyler, armed with his Junior Ranger guidebook and a small LED flashlight that his father Carlos had given him for their weekend wilderness adventure, had been eager to practice his newly acquired wildlife identification skills by searching for nocturnal animals that might be active around the lodge's perimeter. Sophia, who idolized her older cousin and rarely had opportunities for such exciting adventures in her suburban Colorado hometown, had readily agreed to join the impromptu exploration, despite her mother Jennifer's repeated warnings about staying close to the adults throughout the weekend. The two children had made their way onto the deck's eastern section, which provided an elevated platform overlooking the meadow where the afternoon ceremony had taken place, now bathed in silvery moonlight that had begun to filter through the scattered clouds. Tyler had been attempting to locate a great horned owl that had been calling from the forest edge, using his flashlight to scan the tree line, while Sophia peered through the deck's log railing with wide-eyed fascination at her first real wilderness experience. At 8:47 p.m., Tyler's flashlight beam had swept across the meadow and inadvertently illuminated bear number 423, who had advanced to within 25 yards of the lodge and was standing fully upright on his hind legs, a behavior that allowed the bear to better assess the situation while simultaneously demonstrating his impressive physical stature to any potential threats or competitors. The bear's eyes, reflecting the LED light like twin amber beacons in the darkness, had locked onto the children's position on the deck for approximately 15 seconds, a stare down that would be forever burned into Tyler's memory despite the traumatic events that were about to unfold. Sophia's piercing scream of terror, triggered by her first glimpse of the massive predator standing motionless in the moonlit meadow, had shattered the evening's peaceful atmosphere and instantly alerted every person within the lodge to the presence of mortal danger. Her high-pitched cry of "Bear! Bear! There's a bear!" had carried through the open French doors and into the reception hall, where the festive music and animated conversation had ceased, as if someone had thrown a master power switch, replaced by the kind of absolute silence that precedes catastrophic events. The bear's reaction to Sophia's scream had been immediate and decisive, transforming him from a cautious observer into an active threat within the span of heartbeats. Rather than retreating into the safety of the forest, as most wildlife experts would have predicted, bear number 423 had instead interpreted the child's scream as either a challenge to his dominance or an indicator of vulnerability that required investigation. His powerful muscles had propelled him forward with shocking speed, covering the remaining distance to the lodge in less than 6 seconds, moving with the fluid grace that belied his massive size. Inside the reception hall, the transition from celebration to crisis had occurred with brutal swiftness, as 20 adults who'd spent the weekend immersed in the luxury and security of their private wilderness retreat suddenly confronted the reality that they were sharing this environment with creatures that viewed them not as tourists or guests, but as potential competitors or prey. The sound of splintering wood from the lodge's front entrance had provided the first indication that their situation had escalated beyond a simple wildlife sighting into something far more dangerous and immediate. Marcus Thompson, whose environmental law practice had included extensive research into human-wildlife conflict scenarios, had been among the first to recognize the severity of their situation, shouting, "Everyone get to the back of the building now!" while simultaneously pushing his new bride Sarah toward the rear exit that led to the kitchen and service areas. His legal work had included reviewing case files from dozens of bear attacks throughout the Rocky Mountain region, and he understood that their survival would depend entirely on their ability to create distance between themselves and the animal while avoiding the kind of panicked behavior that could trigger a predatory response. David Thompson, drawing on his engineering background and natural problem-solving abilities, had immediately begun organizing the evacuation effort, directing guests toward the lodge's rear entrance while attempting to account for every person in the group, particularly the children whose smaller size and natural tendency toward panic made them the most vulnerable members of their party. His wife, Kelly, had scooped up their twin daughters, Emma and Lily, carrying them toward the designated meeting point behind the kitchen while their father coordinated the movement of the other adults through the narrow doorway that provided their only escape route from the main reception area. Dr. Michael Brennan, whose prosecutorial experience had taught him to remain calm under pressure while rapidly assessing threat levels and potential outcomes, had taken charge of ensuring that his 4-year-old daughter Sophia was safely evacuated, while simultaneously attempting to locate Tyler Rodriguez, whose position on the deck had been compromised by the bear's approach. The sound of Tyler's terrified crying from somewhere outside the building had created an additional layer of urgency and complexity to an already desperate situation. Chef Antoine Dubois and his catering team, who'd been cleaning dishes and preparing late-night snacks in the lodge's kitchen, had found themselves in the unexpected position of witnesses to the bear's entry into the building, as they'd had a clear view of the front entrance through the service window that connected the kitchen to the main reception area. The chef's subsequent description of the bear's appearance would provide investigators with crucial details about the animal's size, condition, and behavior during the critical moments of the attack. The bear came through those French doors like they were made of tissue paper, Chef Dubois would later tell investigators from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. "I've been cooking in wilderness areas for 25 years, and I've seen bears before, but nothing like this. This animal was enormous, and he moved through that room like he owned it, knocking over tables and chairs like they were toys. The sound was incredible. Not just the breaking glass and splintering wood, but this deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once." The bear's entry into the reception hall had been facilitated by the French doors that opened onto the wraparound deck, their lightweight construction and decorative glass panels providing virtually no resistance to an animal capable of generating several thousand pounds of force with his massive forelegs. The doors had essentially disintegrated upon impact, creating a shower of glass fragments and twisted metal framing that scattered across the polished hardwood floor and embedded themselves in the walls and furniture throughout the eastern end of the reception hall. Bear number 4, 23's initial behavior inside the building had demonstrated the complex motivations that drive such encounters, as he'd immediately begun investigating the elaborate table settings and food displays that represented the primary attractants that had drawn him to the lodge in the first place. His powerful nose had led him directly to the wedding cake table, where the 3-tier Huckleberry creation had been positioned for the cutting ceremony that had taken place just 30 minutes earlier. The bear's massive forelegs had swept the entire display onto the floor, along with the crystal champagne glasses and sterling silver serving pieces that had been family heirlooms borrowed from Linda Chen's formal dining collection. The sound of crashing dishes and splintering furniture had punctuated the terrified screams of the wedding guests who'd been caught in the reception hall when the bear had made his entrance, creating a cacophony of human terror and animal aggression that would haunt the survivors for years to come. The lodge's high cathedral ceiling had amplified every sound, creating an acoustic environment that transformed individual screams and crashes into an overwhelming wall of noise that made communication and coordination nearly impossible. Jessica Moore, who'd been standing near the gift table arranging the wedding presents for the traditional opening ceremony, had found herself directly in the bear's path as he'd moved through the reception hall, investigating various food sources. Her position had placed her within striking distance of the animal when he'd reared up on his hind legs to investigate a crystal bowl filled with Jordan almonds that had been positioned on a side table near the fireplace. The bear's massive size in the upright position, nearly 8 feet tall, had transformed him into a creature that seemed to fill the entire space, his dark fur brushing against the light fixtures hanging from the vaulted ceiling. The attack on Jessica had begun at exactly 8:51 p.m., when bear number 423 had apparently perceived her rapid movement toward the rear exit as either threat or a trigger for his predatory instincts. Wildlife behaviorists would later explain that the bear's food-conditioned state had created a heightened level of aggression and territorial behavior that made him far more likely to interpret human movement as a challenge to his access to the food sources he'd been seeking. Jessica's position between the bear and several of the food displays had essentially placed her in direct competition with an animal that had no intention of sharing his perceived resources. The bear's initial strike had caught Jessica across her left shoulder and back, his massive claws raking through the silk fabric of her bridesmaid dress and into the soft tissue underneath with devastating effect. The force of the blow had lifted her completely off her feet and sent her crashing into the stone fireplace surround, where her head had struck the natural rock surface with sufficient impact to cause immediate unconsciousness and what emergency responders would later determine to be a severe traumatic brain injury. Sarah Chen Thompson, who'd been moving toward the rear exit under her new husband's protective guidance, had witnessed her best friend's attack with the kind of crystalline clarity that trauma victims often describe, every detail burned into her memory with photographic precision despite the chaos and terror surrounding the incident. Her subsequent description of the attack would provide investigators with the most detailed account of the bear's behavior during the critical moments of the encounter. Jessica was trying to get to the back door like the rest of us, Sarah would tell investigators during her interview at Bozeman Health Deaconess Hospital 3 days after the attack. She was maybe 10 feet away from safety when the bear turned toward her. I remember thinking she was going to make it, and then suddenly this massive paw just swept across her body like she was nothing. The sound when she hit the fireplace, I'll never forget that sound as long as I live. The sight of Jessica's motionless body crumpled against the fireplace had triggered a wave of panic among the remaining wedding guests, several of whom had attempted to rush to her aid, despite the obvious danger posed by the bear's continued presence in the reception hall. Dr. Robert Chen, drawing on his decades of medical training and surgical experience, had started to move toward his daughter's injured friend before being physically restrained by his son-in-law Marcus, who'd recognized that any rescue attempt would have to wait until the bear could be removed from the building. The bear's behavior following the attack on Jessica had demonstrated the unpredictable nature of such encounters, as he'd apparently lost interest in the human occupants of the building and had instead focused his attention on systematically investigating every potential food source within reach. His powerful nose had led him to the bar area, where Craig Martinez, the bartender, had abandoned his post and fled toward the kitchen, leaving behind an array of appetizers, nuts and fruit garnishes that had been prepared for the evening's cocktail service. Bear number 423 had methodically consumed everything edible within reach, using his massive forelegs to sweep bottles, glasses and serving trays onto the floor while he focused on the food items that had attracted his attention. The sound of breaking glass and splintering wood had continued throughout this feeding behavior, punctuated by the deep, rumbling vocalizations that grizzly bears use to communicate their emotional state and territorial claims to potential competitors. The lodge's remaining occupants had huddled in the kitchen and service areas, separated from the bear by a single wooden door that provided minimal protection against an animal capable of breaking through far more substantial barriers. The terror of listening to the destruction taking place in the next room, while knowing that Jessica remained somewhere in the reception hall, had created a psychological trauma that would affect every survivor for months and years to come. Margaret Caldwell, the lodge owner, had attempted to reach the hunting rifle that she kept locked in a cabinet in her private office. But the bear's position in the main room had made it impossible to access the weapon without exposing herself to the same danger that had befallen Jessica. Her decades of experience as a park ranger had taught her that wounded or cornered bears were exponentially more dangerous than those that were simply seeking food, and she'd made the difficult decision to prioritize the safety of the surviving guests over any attempt to rescue Jessica until professional help could arrive. The first emergency call had been placed at 8:54 p.m. by David Thompson, using his cell phone to contact the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office, while his wife Kelly had attempted to calm their terrified daughters, who'd witnessed enough of the attack to understand that something terrible had happened to the pretty lady in the green dress. David's call to 911 had initiated a complex emergency response that would ultimately involve multiple agencies and dozens of personnel over the following 12 hours. 911, what's your emergency? Dispatcher Jennifer Walsh had answered, her voice maintaining the professional calm that had been trained through hundreds of similar calls, though none involving circumstances quite like these. This is David Thompson at Pine Ridge Lodge on Gallatin River Road, David had responded, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. We have a grizzly bear inside our building, and it's attacked one of our wedding guests. We need immediate help, wildlife officers, paramedics, everyone you can send. There are 22 people here, and we're trapped in the kitchen while the bear is in the main room. Dispatcher Walsh had immediately contacted Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Warden Jake Morrison, who'd been on duty at his home in Bozeman, approximately 45 minutes away from the Pine Ridge Lodge, under normal driving conditions. Morrison, a 15-year veteran of wildlife law enforcement who'd responded to dozens of bear incidents throughout his career, had recognized immediately that this situation represented one of the most serious human-wildlife conflicts he'd encountered. I'll be en route within 5 minutes, Morrison had radioed back to dispatch. Contact the bear management team and get them rolling, and make sure Gallatin County Search and Rescue is notified. If we've got injuries and a bear still on scene, this is going to be a complex operation that'll require specialized personnel and equipment. The Montana Bear Management Team, a specialized unit within Fish, Wildlife and Parks that had been established specifically to handle serious human-bear conflicts, maintained equipment and personnel on standby throughout the peak summer season when such encounters were most likely to occur. Team leader Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a wildlife biologist with a doctorate in animal behavior from Montana State University, had been conducting research in the Beartooth Mountains when she'd received the emergency call and had immediately begun coordinating the response from her mobile command unit. Based on the initial report, we're dealing with a food-conditioned adult male that's already demonstrated aggressive behavior toward humans. Dr. Mitchell had explained to her team during the initial briefing conducted via radio as they'd raced toward the Pine Ridge Lodge from their various locations throughout the region. Our primary objectives are human safety, scene security, and bear removal, in that order. We need to assume this animal is extremely dangerous and plan accordingly. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office had dispatched Deputy Thomas Anderson and Deputy Maria Santos, both of whom had received specialized training in wildlife conflict response, along with the department's mobile command unit that would serve as the incident command post during the extended operation. The response had also included 2 ambulances from Bozeman Health Emergency Services, along with a life flight helicopter that had been placed on standby at Bozeman Yellowstone International Airport in case medical evacuation became necessary. Back at the lodge, the 21 survivors had remained trapped in the kitchen and service areas for nearly 25 minutes, listening to the sounds of continued destruction from the reception hall while attempting to maintain communication with emergency dispatchers and provide updates on their situation. The lodge's landline telephone had been located in the main office, which was accessible from the reception hall, making it impossible to use without exposing someone to potential attack. Cell phone coverage in the remote location had been intermittent, requiring the survivors to take turns moving to different locations within the kitchen area to maintain contact with emergency services. Dr. Rachel O'Connor, the emergency medicine resident, had taken charge of triaging the injuries among the wedding guests who'd been caught in the initial attack, though her assessment had been limited by the fact that Jessica Moore remained separated from the group in the reception hall, where her condition was unknown and her location was dangerously exposed to the bear's continued presence. Several guests had sustained minor cuts from flying glass fragments when the French doors had been destroyed, and Tyler Rodriguez had suffered a sprained ankle during his frantic climb down from the deck when the bear had first appeared. "We need to get to Jessica as soon as possible," Dr. O'Connor had told the group during a whispered consultation in the kitchen's pantry area. Based on what Sarah described, she likely has a head injury and possibly internal trauma from that impact with the fireplace. Every minute we delay could be critical to her survival, but we can't attempt a rescue until that bear is out of the building or neutralized. The sound of the bear's continued feeding behavior had provided both reassurance and terror to the trapped wedding guests, as the noise indicated that the animal was occupied with consuming the available food sources rather than actively hunting for additional human victims. However, the unpredictable nature of wildlife behavior meant that the situation could change rapidly if the bear became frustrated, frightened, or simply finished investigating the available food sources and turned his attention back to the human occupants of the building. Marcus Thompson had attempted to maintain morale among the group by organizing them into specific roles and responsibilities, drawing on his experience with crisis management from his environmental law practice. He'd assigned David and Dr. Brennan to maintain communication with emergency responders, while Kelly Thompson and Jennifer Brennan had focused on keeping the children calm and occupied, despite the terrifying circumstances. The lodge's staff, including Chef Dubois and his catering team, had provided valuable knowledge about the building's layout and potential escape routes, information that would prove crucial if the situation deteriorated further. The first sign that professional help was approaching had come at 9:17 p.m., when the distant sound of sirens had become audible over the noise of the bear's continued destruction in the reception hall. The arrival of emergency vehicles had been carefully coordinated to avoid startling the bear and potentially triggering a renewed aggressive response that could endanger both the trapped wedding guests and the responding personnel. Warden Jake Morrison had been the first to arrive on scene, his specialized wildlife enforcement vehicle equipped with tranquilizer equipment, noisemakers, and other tools specifically designed for bear management situations. His initial assessment from the lodge's parking area had confirmed the severity of the situation, as broken glass and overturned furniture were visible through the damaged French doors, along with clear signs of the bear's continued presence in the form of movement and ongoing destruction, sounds from within the building. "Lodge occupants, this is Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks," Morrison had announced through a battery-powered megaphone, his voice carrying clearly through the damaged doors and windows. "We're establishing a perimeter around the building and preparing for bear removal operations. Please remain in secure areas and maintain communication with our dispatch center. Do not attempt to leave the building or approach the main room where the bear is located." The establishment of the incident command post had required coordination between multiple agencies, each bringing specialized equipment and expertise to address different aspects of the emergency. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office had focused on scene security and traffic control, establishing roadblocks to prevent civilian vehicles from entering the area, while ensuring that additional emergency resources could access the lodge as needed. The bear management team had begun setting up specialized equipment for either tranquilizing or lethally removing the bear, depending on how the situation developed. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had arrived at 9:31 p.m., bringing with her a team of wildlife specialists and the specialized equipment necessary for safely handling a large, aggressive grizzly bear in close proximity to human victims. Her assessment of the situation had confirmed that bear number 423 represented an extreme danger that would require immediate action, as his food-conditioned behavior and demonstrated aggression toward humans had placed him in the category of animals that pose an ongoing threat to public safety. Based on the initial reports and what we're observing from outside the building, this bear has crossed the threshold from nuisance animal to public safety threat, Dr. Mitchell had explained to the assembled emergency responders during her initial briefing. Our protocols are clear in situations like this. The animal will need to be lethally removed, and we need to coordinate that action with the rescue of any injured victims inside the building. The decision to use lethal force against bear number 423 had not been made lightly, as wildlife management agencies typically preferred non-lethal solutions whenever possible to preserve individual animals and maintain healthy population levels. However, the bear's attack on Jessica Moore, combined with his continued aggressive behavior and the presence of 21 additional potential victims trapped in the building, had created circumstances that left no viable alternative to immediate lethal intervention. The specialized equipment required for safely removing a grizzly bear from an occupied building had been transported to the scene by the bear management team's mobile response unit, including high-powered rifles chambered for 300 Winchester Magnum cartridges that were specifically designed for large, dangerous game animals. The team had also brought night vision equipment, portable lighting systems, and communication gear that would allow them to coordinate their actions with the rescue personnel who would need to immediately enter the building to provide medical attention to Jessica Moore. At 9:45 p.m., Dr. Mitchell had made the decision to proceed with the bear removal operation, using a coordinated approach that would minimize the risk to both the emergency responders and the trapped wedding guests. The plan had involved creating a distraction at the front of the building to draw the bear's attention away from the kitchen area where the survivors were located, while a two-person team of marksmen had positioned themselves for clear shots through the damaged French doors. All lodge occupants were beginning bear removal operations, Morrison had announced through the megaphone. Please remain in the back areas of the building and be prepared for loud noises. Do not move toward the main room until we give you the all-clear signal. The sound of the 300 Winchester Magnum rifles firing in rapid succession at 9:47 p.m. had marked the end of bear number 423's life and the beginning of the complex rescue and investigation phase of the incident. The bear had been struck by 4 rounds, fired by wildlife specialists positioned at strategic points around the lodge's perimeter, with each shot placed to ensure immediate incapacitation and prevent any possibility of wounded animal behavior that could have endangered the rescue personnel or surviving victims. The immediate silence that had followed the gunshots had been almost as shocking to the trapped wedding guests as the original sounds of the attack, creating a moment of uncertainty about whether the threat had been neutralized or had simply moved to a different location within the building. The all-clear signal had come at 9:51 p.m., when Warden Morrison had personally entered the reception hall and confirmed that bear number 423 was deceased and posed no further threat to the occupants of the lodge. The rescue of Jessica Moore had begun immediately following the all-clear, with paramedics Jason Webb and Lisa Chen rushing into the reception hall with emergency medical equipment, while Dr. Rachel O'Connor had provided initial medical assessment based on her emergency medicine training. Jessica had been found unconscious against the stone fireplace with severe trauma to her head and back, multiple lacerations from the bear's claws, and signs of significant internal injuries that would require immediate surgical intervention. We've got a female, approximately 30 years old, unconscious with severe head trauma and multiple lacerations. Paramedic Webb had radioed to Bozeman Health's emergency department, while his partner had worked to stabilize Jessica's airway and establish IV access for fluid resuscitation. Patient appears to have been struck by a large animal, possibly thrown against a stone surface. We're going to need life flight and a trauma team standing by. The medical evacuation of Jessica Moore had required the coordination of ground ambulance transport to a nearby meadow where the life flight helicopter could safely land, as the trees surrounding the Pine Ridge Lodge had prevented the aircraft from approaching the building directly. The flight to Bozeman Health Deaconess Hospital had taken 18 minutes, with the trauma team conducting advanced life support procedures during transport, while communicating with the receiving hospital's neurosurgery department about the severity of Jessica's injuries. The remaining 21 wedding guests had been transported to Bozeman Health via ground ambulances, with priority given to treating the psychological trauma and minor physical injuries that had resulted from the attack and its aftermath. Several guests had required treatment for cuts from flying glass, while others had needed medical attention for panic attacks, elevated blood pressure, and other stress-related conditions that had developed during their nearly hour-long ordeal trapped in the lodge's kitchen area. The investigation into the incident had begun immediately, with multiple agencies working to document every aspect of the attack, the emergency response, and the factors that had contributed to the tragic encounter between Bear, number 423, and the wedding party. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks investigators had photographed and measured the bear's remains, collecting tissue samples for disease testing and documenting the animal's physical condition, diet, and other factors that might have influenced his behavior. The necropsy performed on Bear number 423 by Dr. Kevin Walsh, the state's chief wildlife veterinarian, had revealed significant information about the bear's condition and the factors that had contributed to the attack. The animal had been found to be in excellent physical condition, with a body weight of 697 pounds and no signs of disease, injury, or other abnormalities that might have affected his behavior. However, stomach content analysis had confirmed extensive human food consumption over the days leading up to the attack, including evidence of garbage raiding and other food conditioning behaviors that had made him increasingly bold around human habitation. This bear was a prime example of what happens when wild animals lose their natural fear of humans through repeated positive associations with human food sources, Dr. Walsh had explained in his preliminary report. The stomach contents showed clear evidence of human food consumption over an extended period, including processed foods, meat products, and other items that would only be available through contact with human activities. The investigation had also revealed that bear number 423 had been the subject of multiple previous incident reports throughout the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, including documented approaches to campsites, vehicle break-ins, and other food-seeking behaviors that had escalated over the past several years. Wildlife managers had attempted various non-lethal management techniques, including relocation efforts and aversive conditioning, but the bear's learned behavior patterns had proven too well established to modify through these intervention methods. The media coverage of the Pine Ridge Lodge bear attack had begun within hours of the incident, with local news stations in Bozeman and Billings providing initial reports based on scanner traffic and preliminary information from law enforcement sources. By the following morning, the story had attracted national attention, with major news networks sending reporters to Montana to cover what had become one of the most serious grizzly bear attacks in recent decades. The wedding guests had found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight as reporters sought interviews and personal accounts of their terrifying experience. Most had declined to speak publicly during the immediate aftermath, focusing instead on their recovery and supporting Jessica Moore's family during her critical hospitalization. However, the intense media interest had created additional stress for people who were already struggling to process the trauma they'd experienced. Sarah and Marcus Thompson had issued a brief statement through a family spokesperson, expressing their gratitude for the emergency responders who'd saved their lives and asking for privacy while they dealt with the aftermath of the attack. "Our thoughts and prayers are with Jessica and her family during this difficult time," the statement had read. "We're grateful to be alive and want to thank everyone who responded so quickly to help us. We ask that you respect our privacy as we work through this traumatic experience." The hospitalization of Jessica Moore had extended for 6 weeks, during which she'd undergone multiple surgeries to address her traumatic brain injury, internal organ damage, and the extensive lacerations caused by the bear's claws. Her family had maintained a bedside vigil throughout her unconscious period, which had lasted for 12 days following the attack, creating additional emotional stress for everyone who'd been affected by the incident. Jessica's recovery had been complicated by the severity of her head injury, which had required the insertion of a specialized monitoring device to measure intracranial pressure and guide her neurosurgical treatment. Dr. Amanda Foster, the neurosurgeon who'd led Jessica's medical team, had explained to her family that the extent of her recovery would depend on factors that couldn't be determined until she regained consciousness and began responding to rehabilitation efforts. Jessica sustained what we classify as a severe traumatic brain injury, with additional complications from the associated physical trauma, Dr. Foster had told Jessica's parents during one of their daily medical consultations. "We're cautiously optimistic about her long-term prognosis, but brain injuries of this magnitude can have unpredictable outcomes. The fact that she's young and otherwise healthy works in her favor, but we'll need to take her recovery one day at a time." The psychological impact of the attack had affected every member of the wedding party in different ways, with several guests requiring ongoing counseling and therapy to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder, survivor's guilt, and other mental health consequences of their experience. The children who'd witnessed the attack, particularly Tyler Rodriguez and Sophia Brennan, had required specialized treatment from pediatric trauma specialists to help them process what they'd seen and prevent long-term psychological damage. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, had been consulted by several of the wedding guests to provide professional guidance on dealing with the aftermath of their experience. Her assessment had confirmed that the survivors were exhibiting classic symptoms of acute stress disorder, which could develop into more serious long-term conditions if not properly addressed through appropriate therapeutic interventions. What these people experienced goes far beyond what most individuals ever face in their lifetime, Dr. Reynolds had explained to the families seeking her guidance. They witnessed extreme violence, feared for their lives, and lost their sense of safety in what should have been a controlled, predictable environment. The fact that this happened during what was supposed to be one of the happiest days of their lives adds an additional layer of psychological complexity to their recovery process. The investigation into the factors that had contributed to the attack had revealed several systemic issues that extended beyond the specific circumstances of Bear Number 423's behavior. The Pine Ridge Lodge had been operating under permits and regulations that had not required specific wildlife management protocols, despite its location in known grizzly bear habitat. The lack of bear-proof garbage storage, wildlife deterrent lighting, and other preventive measures had created an environment that was more likely to attract and habituate bears to human food sources. Margaret Caldwell, as the lodge owner, had faced intense scrutiny from investigators and media representatives about her preparation for potential wildlife encounters and the adequacy of the safety measures she'd implemented to protect her guests. While she'd possessed extensive knowledge of local wildlife through her background as a park ranger, the lodge had not been equipped with the specialized deterrent systems that wildlife experts recommended for facilities operating in active bear habitat. "I've been in this business for 6 years, and I've never had anything like this happen before," Caldwell had told investigators during her formal interview. "We see bears occasionally, usually from a distance, and they've never shown any aggressive behavior toward the lodge or our guests. I had bear spray available and knew the proper procedures for bear encounters, but nothing in my experience prepared me for an animal that would actually enter the building and attack people." The legal ramifications of the attack had begun to emerge within weeks of the incident, as the wedding guests and their families had retained attorneys to explore potential liability issues related to the lodge's operation and the adequacy of the safety measures that had been in place. The complex nature of human-wildlife conflict liability had required specialized legal expertise, as traditional premises liability law had not contemplated scenarios involving wild animal attacks in commercial hospitality settings. Attorney Michael Stevens, representing several of the wedding guests, had filed preliminary legal actions seeking compensation for medical expenses, lost wages, and psychological trauma resulting from the attack. His investigation had focused on whether the Pine Ridge Lodge had met appropriate standards of care in operating a commercial facility in active grizzly bear habitat, and whether different safety protocols might have prevented the tragic encounter. "Our clients trusted that the Pine Ridge Lodge would provide a safe environment for their celebration, and that trust was tragically misplaced," Stevens had stated during a press conference announcing the legal action. "While we recognize that wildlife encounters can be unpredictable, there are established protocols and safety measures that should be implemented when operating commercial facilities in bear habitat. Our investigation will determine whether those standards were met in this case." The insurance implications of the bear attack had created additional complexity for all parties involved, as most standard liability policies contained exclusions for acts of nature or wild animal attacks that could potentially limit coverage for the damages claimed by the victims. The Pine Ridge Lodge's commercial insurance carrier had initiated its own investigation into the incident, working with wildlife experts and legal counsel to assess their exposure and determine their obligations to the injured parties. The broader implications for wildlife management policy had also emerged as a significant issue in the aftermath of the attack, as conservation organizations, hunting groups, and tourism industry representatives had begun debating the appropriate balance between grizzly bear conservation and public safety in areas where human activity overlapped with recovering wildlife populations. The incident had highlighted the challenges faced by wildlife managers in dealing with food-conditioned bears that had lost their natural fear of humans, but had not yet demonstrated the kind of aggressive behavior that would typically result in their removal from the population. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, in her role as the lead investigator for Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, had testified before a legislative committee examining wildlife management protocols and funding for bear management programs. Her testimony had emphasized the need for increased resources for proactive management of food-conditioned bears, including expanded aversive conditioning programs, improved public education about proper food storage and bear safety, and enhanced coordination between wildlife agencies and commercial operators in bear habitat. The Pine Ridge Lodge attack represents a worst-case scenario that we work every day to prevent, Dr. Mitchell had told the legislative committee. However, as grizzly bear populations continue to recover and expand their range, and as human activity in bear habitat continues to increase, these types of conflicts will become more likely unless we take proactive steps to address the underlying causes. The recovery process for Jessica Moore had extended through multiple phases, beginning with her gradual emergence from unconsciousness after 12 days in the intensive care unit, followed by months of physical rehabilitation to address the motor function deficits caused by her traumatic brain injury. Her speech and cognitive abilities had been significantly affected by the attack, requiring intensive therapy from specialists in neurological rehabilitation to help her relearn basic communication and problem-solving skills. Jessica's family had documented her recovery process through a private blog that they'd shared with friends and supporters, providing updates on her progress while maintaining her privacy during the most difficult phases of her rehabilitation. The blog had revealed the extraordinary challenges faced by traumatic brain injury patients and their families, including the unpredictable nature of recovery and the emotional toll of dealing with personality changes and cognitive deficits that might be permanent. Today, Jessica said her first complete sentence since the attack. Her mother had written in a blog entry dated September 3rd, 7 weeks after the incident. She asked for water, and when the nurse brought it to her, she said thank you, clearly enough that we all understood. It seems like such a small thing, but for us, it feels like the biggest victory in the world. We're taking this recovery one word, one day, one small step at a time. The impact on the other wedding guests had varied significantly, with some individuals recovering relatively quickly from the psychological trauma, while others had continued to struggle with symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder months after the attack. Sarah and Marcus Thompson had postponed their planned honeymoon indefinitely, focusing instead on supporting Jessica's recovery and dealing with their own emotional processing of the traumatic events that had overshadowed what should have been the happiest day of their lives. The children who'd witnessed the attack had shown remarkable resilience in some ways, though they'd also developed specific fears and anxiety behaviors that had required ongoing therapeutic intervention. Tyler Rodriguez had become obsessed with learning everything possible about bear behavior and safety, reading every book and article he could find about wildlife encounters while simultaneously developing a phobia of outdoor activities that had previously been among his favorite pastimes. Sophia Brennan had experienced nightmares and separation anxiety that had significantly disrupted her family's daily routines, requiring her parents to implement specialized bedtime rituals and provide constant reassurance about her safety. Her father, Michael, had taken a temporary leave of absence from his prosecutorial duties to focus on helping his daughter recover from the trauma, recognizing that her healing would require extensive time and attention from her family support system. The Pine Ridge Lodge had remained closed following the attack, as Margaret Caldwell had worked with insurance investigators, wildlife experts, and regulatory agencies to determine what modifications would be necessary to safely resume operations. The comprehensive review had revealed the need for significant infrastructure improvements, including the installation of bear-proof garbage storage systems, enhanced exterior lighting designed to deter wildlife, and reinforced doors and windows that could withstand potential animal encounters. The financial impact of the extended closure had created additional stress for Caldwell, whose business had depended entirely on the seasonal wedding and retreat bookings that generated the majority of her annual revenue. The uncertainty about when or whether the lodge could reopen had forced her to consider selling the property, despite her deep personal attachment to the land and the business she'd built following her husband's death. The investigation into bear number 423's background had revealed a complex history of human-wildlife interactions that had contributed to his eventual attack on the wedding party. Genetic analysis had confirmed that he was the offspring of a sow that had been relocated multiple times during the 1990s due to garbage raiding behavior in Yellowstone National Park, suggesting that food conditioning behaviors might have been learned and passed down through family groups. The bear's movement patterns, reconstructed through analysis of hair samples collected at various locations throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, had shown that he'd been ranging over an area of approximately 800 square miles, with regular visits to developed areas where human food sources were available. This extensive travel pattern had made it difficult for wildlife managers to predict his location or implement targeted management actions before his behavior escalated to dangerous levels. Dr. Kevin Walsh's complete necropsy report had provided additional insights into the bear's condition and behavior, revealing that his teeth showed evidence of extensive wear consistent with consuming hard objects like aluminum cans and plastic containers that he'd encountered while raiding garbage sources. His overall health had been excellent, with no signs of parasites, disease, or nutritional deficiencies that might have altered his normal behavior patterns. The stomach contents analysis had painted a detailed picture of bear number 423's diet in the days leading up to the attack, including evidence of human food consumption that had occurred at multiple locations throughout the region. Investigators had been able to trace some of these food sources to specific incidents of garbage raiding and campsite intrusions that had been reported to wildlife authorities but had not been successfully linked to individual animals. The media coverage of the incident had evolved over the months following the attack, shifting from initial sensationalized reporting about the dramatic wildlife encounter to more in-depth analysis of the complex issues surrounding human-wildlife coexistence in the modern American West. National Geographic had produced a documentary examining the incident within the broader context of grizzly bear recovery, while several academic journals had published research papers analyzing the attack as a case study in wildlife management and human-animal conflict resolution. The tourism industry throughout Montana and the greater Yellowstone region had grappled with the potential impact of the attack on visitor perceptions and booking patterns, as tour operators and hospitality businesses had worked to address guest concerns about wildlife safety while maintaining the appeal of authentic wilderness experiences. Some facilities had implemented enhanced safety protocols and educational programs, while others had chosen to emphasize the statistical rarity of such incidents and the overall safety record of wildlife tourism in the region. The legal proceedings had continued to develop over the months following the attack, with multiple parties involved in complex negotiations about liability, insurance coverage, and compensation for the various damages suffered by the wedding guests. The unique nature of the incident had created precedent-setting questions about the responsibilities of commercial operators in wildlife habitat, and the extent to which such businesses could be held liable for unpredictable animal behavior. Jessica Moore's long-term prognosis had remained uncertain even months after the attack, as her recovery from traumatic brain injury had followed the unpredictable course that characterized such injuries. While she'd regained much of her speech and motor function, she'd continued to struggle with memory problems, concentration difficulties, and personality changes that had affected her ability to return to her nursing career and maintain her previous lifestyle. The Seattle Children's Hospital, where Jessica had worked as a pediatric nurse, had held her position open during her recovery, but it had become increasingly clear that her cognitive deficits might prevent her from safely returning to the complex, high-stress environment of pediatric medical care. Her colleagues had organized fundraising efforts to support her ongoing rehabilitation costs and living expenses during her extended recovery period. The impact on the Chen and Thompson families had extended far beyond the immediate trauma of the attack, affecting their relationships, career decisions, and long-term life planning in ways they were still discovering months later. Sarah had taken a temporary leave from her veterinary practice to focus on her own psychological recovery and to support Jessica's rehabilitation, while Marcus had found his environmental law work increasingly difficult as he struggled with conflicting feelings about wildlife conservation in light of his personal experience with the dangers posed by large predators. The wedding gifts that had been destroyed during Bear Number 423's rampage through the reception hall had included family heirlooms, expensive electronics, and sentimental items that could never be replaced, creating an additional layer of loss for the couple as they'd attempted to rebuild their lives following the attack. The insurance claims process for these items had been complicated by the unusual nature of their destruction and the difficulty of documenting the value of items that had been shredded, scattered, and contaminated during the bears' feeding behavior. The Pine Ridge Lodge had eventually reopened in the spring of 2026, following extensive renovations and the implementation of comprehensive wildlife deterrent systems that had been designed by leading experts in human-bear conflict prevention. The renovation had cost nearly $300,000 and had included the installation of electrified fencing around the immediate lodge grounds, motion-activated lighting systems, bear-proof garbage storage facilities, and reinforced doors and windows throughout the building. Margaret Caldwell had also implemented mandatory bear safety training for all guests, with detailed briefings about proper behavior in bear habitat and emergency procedures in case of wildlife encounters. The lodge's marketing materials had begun emphasizing the comprehensive safety measures while maintaining focus on the authentic wilderness experience that continued to attract visitors to the remote location. The first wedding held at the reopened Pine Ridge Lodge had been conducted with heightened security measures and the presence of a Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks officer on site throughout the event, creating a new standard for wildlife safety at commercial facilities operating in active bear habitat. The couple who'd chosen to hold their celebration at the lodge, despite its tragic history, had appreciated the enhanced safety protocols while recognizing the importance of supporting the local tourism economy that depended on facilities like the Pine Ridge Lodge. The scientific study of Bear Number 423's attack had contributed to improved understanding of food-conditioned bear behavior and had influenced wildlife management protocols throughout North America. Researchers had used the detailed documentation of the incident to develop better predictive models for identifying bears that posed elevated risks to human safety, leading to more proactive management approaches that could prevent similar tragedies in other locations. The case had also become a standard reference point in wildlife management training programs, with the detailed timeline and behavioral analysis serving as educational material for new wildlife officers and researchers studying human-animal conflict resolution. The incident had demonstrated both the challenges and the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries between human activities and wildlife habitat in an era of expanding human development and recovering predator populations. Jessica Moore's eventual return to limited nursing duties in late 2026 had marked a significant milestone in her recovery. Though she'd continued to require accommodations for her ongoing cognitive deficits and had needed to transition to a less demanding position within the hospital system. Her colleagues had celebrated her perseverance and gradual improvement while recognizing that her life had been permanently altered by the traumatic events at the Pine Ridge Lodge. The anniversary of the attack had become an annual reminder of the complex relationship between humans and wildlife in the modern American West, with media outlets typically revisiting the story to examine ongoing developments in wildlife management and human-animal coexistence strategies. The incident had served as a catalyst for policy changes and increased funding for proactive wildlife management programs throughout the region. The long-term psychological impact on all the wedding guests had varied significantly, with some individuals successfully processing their trauma through therapy and support systems, while others had continued to struggle with anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms that had required ongoing professional treatment. The shared nature of their experience had created lasting bonds among some survivors, while creating painful associations for others who'd preferred to avoid reminders of their ordeal. Sarah and Marcus Thompson had eventually established a foundation dedicated to supporting traumatic brain injury research and wildlife safety education, channeling their experience into positive contributions that honored Jessica's struggle and helped prevent similar tragedies. The foundation had funded research grants, educational programs, and support services that had benefited countless individuals affected by both wildlife encounters and brain injuries throughout the region. The Pine Ridge Lodge bear attack had ultimately become recognized as a watershed moment in understanding the challenges of human-wildlife coexistence in the 21st century, demonstrating both the beauty and the inherent risks of sharing landscapes with recovering predator populations. The incident had influenced policy decisions, management protocols, and public awareness campaigns that had contributed to improved safety measures and reduced conflict potential throughout bear habitat across North America. The legacy of Bear Number 423 and the tragic events of July 15, 2025, had extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families, contributing to a broader understanding of the complex relationship between human activities and wildlife conservation in an increasingly developed landscape. The incident had served as a sobering reminder that successful wildlife recovery carried inherent risks that required ongoing vigilance, education, and adaptive management approaches to ensure the safety of both human communities and the wild animals that shared their environment. The final resolution of the legal proceedings had taken nearly 3 years, with settlements reached that had provided compensation for medical expenses, lost wages, and psychological trauma, while establishing precedents for liability in wildlife-related incidents at commercial facilities. The settlements had also funded ongoing research and education programs designed to prevent similar tragedies while supporting the continued recovery of grizzly bear populations throughout their historic range. The story of the Pine Ridge Lodge attack had become required reading in wildlife management programs, emergency response training courses, and hospitality industry safety protocols, serving as a comprehensive case study in the complex factors that could contribute to catastrophic human-wildlife encounters. The detailed documentation of every aspect of the incident, from the bear's behavioral history to the long-term recovery of the human survivors, had provided valuable insights that had informed policy and practice throughout the wildlife management community. Jessica Moore's gradual return to a fulfilling life, despite her ongoing challenges, had become a symbol of human resilience and the possibility of recovery from even the most traumatic experiences. Her journey had inspired others facing similar challenges while demonstrating the importance of comprehensive support systems and specialized medical care in addressing the complex needs of traumatic brain injury survivors. The Pine Ridge Lodge continued to operate successfully, serving as a model for wildlife safety in commercial hospitality while maintaining the authentic wilderness experience that drew visitors to Montana's spectacular landscapes. The facility's comprehensive safety protocols and educational programs had been adopted by similar operations throughout the region, contributing to improved safety standards that had helped prevent additional tragic encounters. The memory of the July 15, 2025 grizzly attack had ultimately served as both a tragic reminder of nature's power and an inspiration for improved coexistence strategies that honored both human safety and wildlife conservation values. The incident had demonstrated that even the most careful planning could not eliminate all risks in wild landscapes, but that proper preparation, education, and response protocols could significantly reduce the likelihood and severity of such encounters. The ongoing recovery of all those affected by the attack had continued to serve as a testament to human resilience and the importance of community support in overcoming trauma, while the continued presence of grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem had represented the success of conservation efforts that had brought a threatened species back from the brink of extinction. The challenge of balancing these competing values had remained a central focus of wildlife management policy and practice throughout the region and beyond.